Margaret Ellis set the plate down in front of the wealthiest man in Converse County, Wyoming, and didn't flinch when he pushed it away without tasting it. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She picked up the plate, walked straight back to that kitchen, and started over from nothing, just like she had done with every broken thing in her life. Behind her, 14 ranch hands watched in silence. Some were waiting for her to quit. Some were waiting to see what she'd do next. Not one of them was ready for what happened. Before we go any further, if stories about quiet courage, stubborn love, and the people who save us without asking for credit speak to your heart, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Margaret Ellis and everything that happened after she walked into Caleb Whitaker's kitchen. The morning. Margaret Ellis stepped off the eastbound stage in Rawlins, Wyoming. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind cut straight through her wool coat like it had somewhere important to be, and didn't much care about the damage it left behind. She carried 2 suitcases. One held her clothes. One held everything else she owned in the world, a cast-iron skillet wrapped in a dish towel, 3 handwritten recipe books, and a photograph of her mother. She hadn't been able to look at in 2 years, because looking at it still made her chest feel like someone had pressed a boot directly onto her sternum and wasn't planning on moving it anytime soon. She was 27 years old. She was traveling to marry a man she had never met. And the only person on the platform who paid her any attention at all was a skinny boy of about 15, who was leaning against the hitching post, staring at her like he was trying to work out a puzzle. "You Margaret Ellis," he said. "I am," she said. "You're smaller than I expected." Margaret picked up both suitcases without asking for help. "Most things are," she said. "Take me to the ranch." His name was Eli Pruitt. He worked the stables at Whitaker Ranch, and he talked the entire 40-minute ride out of town about the weather, about the cattle, about the men in the bunkhouse, and how they'd been betting amongst themselves about what Caleb Whitaker's mail-order bride was going to look like. He told her this without any apparent awareness that she might find it unkind, which she didn't particularly. She'd been hearing that kind of talk her whole life, and had made a decision somewhere around her 14th birthday that other people's expectations were their problem and not hers. What were they saying? She asked. Not because she cared, but because the boy looked like he was burning to tell her. Eli's ears turned red. "Well," he said, "some of the boys thought Mr. Whitaker would have ordered somebody fancier." "Fancier," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret looked out across the flat expanse of Wyoming territory, rolling past them in every direction. The sage brush, the brittle grass, the mountains sitting blue and enormous in the distance like they were deciding whether or not to get involved. "How long has the ranch been without a proper cook?" she asked. Eli blinked. "How'd you know about that?" "Because a man doesn't write to a placement agency looking for a wife unless the thing he actually needs is a woman who can manage a household," she said. "How long?" Eli was quiet for a moment. 7, maybe 8 months, he admitted. "Old Pete left last spring. Mr. Whitaker's been paying 2 of the younger hands to take turns in the kitchen, but they can't cook much more than beans and salt pork. Men are about half sick of it." "I imagine they are," Margaret said. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the ride, but when the wagon crested the last hill and the full spread of Whitaker Ranch came into view below the main house, sitting solid and large at the center of it, the bunkhouses and barns stretching out to the east, the cattle visible as dark moving shapes against the pale winter grass. She leaned forward just slightly, the way a person does when they're taking in something they intend to remember. She was not overwhelmed by it. She was not intimidated. She was measuring it the way she measured every kitchen she had ever walked into for the first time, looking for what was broken, what was wasted, and what could be fixed. Caleb Whitaker was standing on the front porch when the wagon pulled up. He was taller than she'd expected, broad across the shoulders. He had the kind of stillness about him that Margaret had learned to recognize over the years, the stillness of a man who had trained himself not to show anything, not because he didn't feel things, but because he'd learned at some point that showing them cost too much. He was wearing a dark vest over a gray shirt, his hat pulled low, and he was watching her climb down from the wagon with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't unfriendly. It wasn't welcoming. It was careful, the way a man looks at something he's already committed to owning but isn't sure yet what to do with. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Miss Ellis," he finally said. "Mr. Whitaker," she said back. "You had a good journey. A long one." Another pause. Behind him, through the front window, she could see the shapes of ranch hands lingering just inside the doorway watching. "I'll have someone show you your room," he said. "I'd rather see the kitchen first," she said. Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, but close. "The kitchen." "Yes," she said. "I'll need to know what I'm working with before I can plan supper." He studied her for a second longer, then stepped aside and held the door open. "Come inside then," he said. "I'll take you myself." The kitchen was worse than she'd anticipated, which was saying something, because she had anticipated fairly bad. The wood stove needed a thorough cleaning, the firebox was half choked with ash, and the stovepipes were overdue for sweeping. The pantry was a disaster of half-opened sacks, spoiled cornmeal and provisions that had been stored without any logic Margaret could detect. A barrel of flour had been left open and had gone partially damp. 3 sacks of dried beans sat in the corner, which was good, but they'd been dumped in without any sorting. The tools were dull, the work surfaces were not properly clean, and whoever had been attempting to cook in this kitchen had been doing it without any system whatsoever. She walked through it slowly, opening cabinet doors, lifting lids, checking what was there and what wasn't. Caleb stood in the doorway watching her. She didn't look at him while she worked. "How many men are you feeding?" she asked. 18 most days. 3 meals. Breakfast before dawn, dinner at noon, supper in the evening. She closed the last cabinet door and turned around. "I'll need a new barrel of flour tomorrow morning. That one's done. The lard is almost out. You've got enough dried beans to last about 2 weeks if I'm careful. I'll need salt, baking powder, and someone who can tell me where the nearest butcher operates out of." Caleb looked at her steadily. "You've been in the kitchen 20 minutes. "I have eyes," she said simply. He was quiet. Then, "I'll send Eli to Rollins in the morning." "Good," she said. "Tonight I'll work with what's here." She didn't ask whether that was all right. She turned back toward the stove and started clearing the ash from the firebox. After a moment, she heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway toward his study. Behind her, just outside the kitchen doorway, she heard the low murmur of male voices, low enough that they didn't think she could make out the words, but sound traveled in an empty house. "She's something, ain't she?" That was Eli, she was fairly sure, a deeper voice, older, skeptical. "She's small. Lot of women are small, Carter. Small women don't last a Wyoming winter." "She came all the way from Kansas by herself," Eli said, "on a stagecoach. Ain't the same thing." Margaret set the ash pan aside and reached for the stove brush without comment. She'd been hearing some version of that conversation since she was 15 years old, and she had a simple, reliable policy about it. She let people talk, and then she cooked. She had learned to cook in the worst kitchen she'd ever encountered, a boarding house in Wichita, Kansas, where she'd worked from the age of 14 for a woman named Clara Bowen, who ran the place like a military operation and had precisely 0 patience for error, weakness, or anything she referred to as dithering. Clara had been demanding and difficult, and had never once told Margaret that anything she made was good. She had also taught her more about feeding large groups of people efficiently, economically, and well than anyone else Margaret had ever met, and Margaret had never quite figured out whether to resent her or be grateful. She'd done both, she supposed, and decided they weren't mutually exclusive. By the time the supper hour arrived, the stove was burning clean and steady, and the kitchen smelled like something that had never been in it before, specifically like supper that a person might actually want to eat. She'd made a beef and vegetable stew from the remains of a half-used beef roast she'd found in the cold box, combined with dried vegetables, reconstituted in broth, seasoned with what herbs she'd found, and some of her own that she'd packed and served with cornbread that she'd managed despite the sorry state of the flour. The cornbread wasn't perfect. The flour was slightly off, and she knew it. But it was the best that could be done with what she had, and she'd made peace with that before she ever put it in the oven. She carried the first pot out to the long table in the dining room herself, because she wasn't going to ask anyone to help her with something she was fully capable of doing herself. She set it down in the center of the table, put the cornbread beside it, and stepped back. The ranch hands filtered in slowly, the way men do when they're not sure what they're about to encounter. There were 14 of them at supper. 4 were still out on the range, and they settled into their seats with the wariness of people who had been disappointed by this room before and were managing their expectations accordingly. The one named Carter, the foreman she'd gathered, sat at the far end of the table, his arms crossed, watching her with the particular brand of suspicion she recognized as the professional kind. The kind that wasn't personal, just structural. He was a man who had run this operation through difficult months, and he wasn't about to let some stranger walk in here and take over a single square foot of ground he hadn't personally agreed to yield. She ladled out the first bowl and slid it in front of the youngest hand at the table, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, sitting next to Eli, who was watching her with wide, hopeful eyes that she found touching and also slightly exhausting. "Go ahead," she said. The boy picked up his spoon with the resigned caution of someone who had learned the hard way to test things before committing. He took a spoonful of the stew. He chewed. He went very still. Then he took another spoonful faster this time. "Lord," he said, not loudly but sincerely. "Don't take the Lord's name," someone down the table said automatically, and he said, "Sorry, sir, but ma'am, this is," and stopped, apparently unable to find the word. Margaret finished ladling out bowls. By the time she had served the last man, the table had gone quiet in a way that was entirely different from the silence of men who had nothing to say. This was the silence of men who were concentrating, who were tasting something and doing the math of it without even meaning to, comparing it against 14 years of adequate food and 2 seasons of bad food and 8 months of food that was technically edible and nothing more. Carter ate. He didn't say anything. He watched her from the far end of the table with an expression she still couldn't fully read, but he ate all of it, and when he was finished, he set his spoon down in an empty bowl and didn't look at her again, which she took as a signal of something, though she wasn't certain yet what. Caleb Whitaker sat at the head of the table. He had come in last, sat down without ceremony, and when she'd set his bowl in front of him, he'd glanced up at her briefly, just a glance, and said nothing. She'd said nothing back, and moved on to the next man. She ate her own supper in the kitchen after the table was cleared. She sat on a stool by the stove, which was still warm, and ate her stew without ceremony or self-pity. This was habit. She had eaten in kitchens her whole working life. She did not particularly mind it. She was washing the dishes when she heard the footstep in the doorway behind her. "The men are asking about breakfast," Caleb said. She kept washing. "What time does the morning crew go out?" 5 o'clock. "Then I'll have breakfast ready by 4:30. A pause. "That's early." "It is," she agreed. Another pause, longer this time. She heard him shift his weight, that particular sound a man makes when he's working up to saying something that doesn't come easily to him. "It was good," he said finally. "Supper." She set a clean pan on the drying rack. "Thank you." She did not turn around. She wasn't sure why entirely. Some instinct told her that if she turned around now and looked at him, something would be at risk, some careful balance between them, that she was still working out the geometry of. She wasn't ready yet to know what she'd see on his face, so she kept washing. She heard him leave without another word. She didn't sleep much that first night. She lay in the bed in the small room they'd given her, clean, plain, adequate, and stared at the ceiling and made lists in her head, the way she always did when she was figuring out a new kitchen, what she had, what she needed, what could be salvaged, what had to be replaced entirely. It was a habit she'd developed so young that she barely recognized it as unusual anymore, this tendency to respond to new and uncertain situations by taking inventory. She was not particularly frightened. She was not particularly hopeful. She was, as she often was, simply practical. She had made a decision. She was here, and she would do the work that was in front of her. That was all she knew how to do. That was, she suspected, all she'd ever known how to do, and there was a question underneath that thought that she was not yet ready to ask herself, so she didn't. She counted her supplies instead and fell asleep somewhere around midnight. She was up by 3:30. The kitchen was cold in the pre-dawn, But the stove lit quickly once she'd coaxed the fire back to life, and within 20 minutes, the chill was back off the air, and she had the first of the coffee on. She was making biscuits. Proper biscuits, the kind that took technique and didn't forgive shortcuts, when Eli wandered in still half asleep, drawn by the smell, and stopped dead in the doorway. "Are those?" he started. "Sit down and stay out of the way," she said not unkindly. He sat down at the kitchen table and watched her work with the reverence of a man observing something he doesn't fully understand but recognizes as significant. She moved through the kitchen with the economy of a person who had never wasted a motion in her life. The biscuits rolled and cut, the bacon laid into the second pan, the eggs waiting. When the first of the hands came in off the bunkhouse steps, rubbing sleep from their eyes and bracing against the cold, they walked through the kitchen door and stopped. The smell hit them like a physical thing. "Is that bacon?" someone said. "And biscuits." Eli confirmed with proprietary pride, as though he'd had anything to do with it. There was a moment Margaret clocked it precisely because she'd witnessed versions of it before in other kitchens with other groups of people, where the decision happened collectively and without any single person making it consciously. This woman is going to be allowed to stay. Not because she had been invited. Not because Caleb Whitaker had married her. Because she had made biscuits at 4:30 in the morning, and the biscuits were real. Carter came through last. He was fully awake, which told her he was always fully awake this early, which told her something about him that she filed away for later. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the table, the biscuits stacked in a cloth-covered basket, the eggs scrambled and warm, the bacon crisp, the coffee hot, and then he looked at her. "You need anything from the supply shed, you tell me?" he said. "Not the boy." "All right," she said. He nodded once sharply and sat down. She had been at Whitaker Ranch for less than 24 hours. She had cooked 2 meals. And Samuel Carter, who by everything she'd gathered in the last 18 hours, was the single most immovable object on the property, had just told her she could ask him directly. She kept her face neutral and poured herself a cup of coffee. That was the first week. By the end of it, she had transformed the pantry from a chaos of half-managed provisions into a system that any person could navigate without difficulty. Everything labeled, everything dated, nothing stored where it didn't belong. She had identified which supplies were being wasted and which were being under-ordered. She had discovered that Caleb had been sending Eli to town for provisions twice a month, which was inefficient, and that the local supply merchant in Rollins had been consistently overcharging on salt pork because nobody at the ranch had been paying close enough attention to the invoices. She found this out by comparing 3 months of receipts she found stuffed in a kitchen drawer against the current posted prices at the merchant, and when she brought the discrepancy quietly to Caleb's attention, showing him the receipts with the numbers written out plainly, he looked at them for a long moment without speaking. "How much over the fair price?" he said. "About 18%, she said. "Consistently. Across 3 months, it adds up to something significant." He looked up from the receipts. "You found these in the kitchen drawer?" "Yes." "And you know the going rate for salt pork in Rollins." "I asked Eli," she said. "He had a good sense of it." Another of those pauses she was beginning to map. Not because they made her uncomfortable, she'd discovered, but because they had a shape to them. Caleb Whitaker didn't waste words, and when he went quiet, he wasn't being cold or dismissive. He was thinking, actually thinking, and she had learned to read the difference between a man who went silent because he had nothing to say, and a man who went silent because he had a great deal to say and was deciding how much of it to release. "I'll deal with the merchant," he said. "That's your decision," she said. "I just thought you'd want to know." She turned back to the stove. Behind her, she heard him fold the receipts and put them in his vest pocket. Then, "You do this sort of thing naturally, the numbers." "Numbers don't lie," she said. "I find that restful." I didn't respond to that, but she heard what might very possibly, very faintly have been a quiet sound of amusement before his footsteps moved back down the hallway. The second week brought its own education. She learned that 2 of the Hands brothers named Dale and Roy Finch had been quietly rotating the kitchen duty between them since Pete left in the spring, and they had done it without complaint, but with the profound misery of men who knew they were bad at something and were doing it anyway, out of simple necessity. When she told Dale that he was officially relieved of kitchen rotation, he grabbed her hand and shook it with a vigor that startled her. "Ma'am," he said, "I cannot tell you how grateful I am. I gave a man a bean stew last February that I genuinely believe made him sicker than the illness he already had." "The illness he already had," she repeated. "He had a cold," Dale said. "He recovered from the cold fine. The stew was another matter." She learned that the youngest hand, the boy at supper, who'd taken the first bite, whose name was Tommy Gillis, had come to the ranch at 16 after his family's farm in Nebraska had failed, and that he had been sending half his wages back to his mother every month for 2 years. She learned this from Eli, who told her most things eventually, if she waited long enough, and she started quietly doubling Tommy's portions at every meal without making a point of it. And if he noticed, he never said anything, and if the other men noticed, they pretended they didn't. She learned that Carter's left shoulder gave him trouble on cold mornings. She could tell by the careful way he moved his arm at breakfast, the slight catch in it that he worked hard to conceal. She started having a cup of hot, waiting for him when he came in from the early rounds, placed on the counter by the stove, where the warmth would carry, and she never mentioned the shoulder, and he never thanked her for the coffee, and she thought that was probably exactly right. She learned that Caleb Whitaker ate almost everything she put in front of him without comment, but that he always ate everything on the plate, which she had learned over years of cooking meant something specific, meant that a person was getting genuine nourishment from food rather than simply fuel, and that on the 2 occasions she had put something on the table that she'd considered experimental. She'd caught him looking at it for a moment before eating, which was not the look of a man who disliked what he was seeing. On the evening of this 10th day, she was sitting at the kitchen table after supper with her recipe book updating her supply notes, when she heard his step in the hallway, and then the pause outside the kitchen door that she'd also learned to recognize. "You can come in," she said without looking up. "It's your kitchen." "I'm aware," he said, and walked in and sat down across the table from her. He put a cup of coffee on the table between them. He'd poured it himself from the pot she'd left on the stove, and he sat in the kind of stillness that would have made her uncomfortable 2 weeks ago, and now just seemed like him. "You learned Carter's shoulder," he said. She looked up from her book. "I noticed it." "He doesn't let people notice things about him." "Most people don't notice quietly enough," she said. "They notice in a way that makes a person feel seen, which isn't always what someone wants." Caleb considered this. "And you notice the way he'd prefer." "I hope so," she said. He looked at her across the table for a moment. Not the careful assessing look he'd given her on that first day on the porch. Not the look of a man taking inventory of a commitment he'd made. Something else. Something she didn't have a name for yet, and something she was being very careful not to examine too closely. "I made a mistake," he said. "With the merchant in Rollins. I trusted a system that needed oversight, and I didn't provide it. Those receipts, that's months of it. Busy men make those mistakes," she said. "I'm always busy," he said. "That's not a reason." She looked at him steadily. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He seemed to appreciate that she didn't argue with him or soften it. "You're going to find more of them," he said. "Things I've missed." "Probably," she said. "Tell me when you do." "All right," she said. He picked up his coffee and was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know something, Miss Ellis." She waited. "The arrangement between us." He stopped, started again. "I don't expect things from you that weren't agreed to. The household management, the kitchen. That's the agreement. I'm not asking for more than that." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something underneath the words, something she recognized not because she'd seen it in him specifically, but because she'd seen it in rooms full of people who had been hurt and had decided very rationally that the safest thing to do was to reduce expectations on all sides and manage accordingly. "I understand," she said. "I want you to be comfortable here," he said. "As much as possible." "I am," she said. And because it was true, and because she thought he deserved the truth rather than courtesy, more than I expected to be. His jaw shifted slightly. Something he did she'd noticed when something landed that he hadn't prepared for. "That's good," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He left 20 minutes later, and she sat alone in the warm kitchen with her recipe book and her coffee and looked at the stove she'd cleaned and the pantry she'd organized and the kitchen that was starting just barely to feel like hers. Not because Caleb Whitaker had given it to her, but because she had put herself into it morning after morning, meal after meal, with everything she knew how to give. She had been afraid coming here. Not of the ranch or the man or the distance from everything she'd known. She was too practical to be afraid of geography. She had been afraid of the thing that the practical parts of her couldn't manage, the possibility that she would arrive somewhere and pour herself into it, and it still wouldn't be enough. That she would do everything right, and it still wouldn't add up to a place where she belonged. But the kitchen was warm. The stove was clean. Somewhere down the hallway, a man she barely knew had sat across from her and asked her to tell him when she found the things he'd missed, and had meant it. And that was a small thing, probably by most measures. She thought it might not be small. She closed her recipe book and blew out the lamp. By the third week, word had started traveling. It traveled the way things travel in isolated territory, slowly at first, and then all at once. It started with one of the Whitaker hands mentioned to a hand from the neighboring Decker spread that he'd started declining the offer of supper in town when the crews met at the stock pens on Thursday afternoons because the food at Whitaker was better now and worth getting back for. The Decker hand told the Decker foreman. The Decker foreman mentioned it to another ranch operation at the Territorial Livestock Office in Rawlins. Somewhere along the route of that conversation, the name Margaret Ellis was attached to it, though by the time it reached most people, it had simply become Whitaker's new wife, or that woman Caleb married. And the story attached to the name was simple. She cooked like nobody had eaten in years. This was Margaret thought when she heard about it from Eli, who told her with transparent delight, clearly expecting her to be pleased. Somewhat embarrassing, but she couldn't deny that it was good for the men. A working ranch ran on morale as much as muscle, and the morale at Whitaker had been quietly eroding for months before she arrived. She could see it in the way the men talked, or more accurately didn't talk, at the beginning of mealtimes, the flat heads down energy of people going through motions rather than building something. She'd seen that before in other places, and she knew what it cost. She knew what it cost because she'd felt it herself. The dinner she'd pushed away from on Caleb's first night, the one he'd left uneaten, had not been a test or a statement. She'd looked at the plate he'd returned to the kitchen, and she'd understood immediately what it was. It was the food of a man who was keeping himself alive without particularly caring about it, which was a kind of information, and she'd filed it away, the way she filed everything. She'd started quietly adjusting his meals. Not obviously. She wasn't interested in making a point. But a man who ate the same adequate food day after day and never asked for more or commented or changed his order was a man who had stopped noticing what was in front of him. And that kind of not noticing, Margaret had found, tended to spread from the table outward into everything else in a person's life. So she started varying what she put in front of him. Not dramatically, nothing theatrical, just the subtle rotation of things, prepared slightly differently. Small additions of flavor adjustments in the seasoning that required a person to actually pay attention to what they were eating. He noticed on a Tuesday in the third week at supper. She saw it happen, saw the slight pause, the fractional tilt of his head, the moment of genuine attention. I didn't say anything, but he looked up from his plate and found her already watching from the kitchen doorway. And for a moment, they looked at each other across the length of the dining room, and she lifted one shoulder in a shrug that said nothing in particular, and also said quite a lot. And he looked back down at his plate and finished his supper. The next morning, he was in the kitchen at 5 o'clock, earlier than usual, before the hands came in. "You changed something," he said. "Several things," she said. She was rolling out pie dough. She'd found dried apples in the back of the pantry, which was a genuine windfall. The dough for the morning biscuits, the ratio in the coffee, what I'm doing with the bacon. "The supper," he said. "Last night." "That too." He watched her work for a moment. "Why?" She glanced at him briefly. "Because there's no reason for food to be only adequate when it can be good. I've eaten adequate food for years." "I know," she said. Another pause. "You didn't ask me." "You weren't going to tell me what you wanted," she said, matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. "So I paid attention instead." She felt him looking at her. It was a different quality of looking than she'd gotten from him before, not assessing, not careful, not managed. She went on rolling out the dough. "That's presumptuous," he said, but without particular heat. "Probably," she agreed. "Would you prefer I go back to the way it was?" The silence stretched out long enough that she looked up. He was watching her with an expression she still couldn't fully translate, but that she was beginning to suspect meant something like, "I don't know how to handle you, and I'm not sure whether that's a problem or not." "No," he said. "All right then," she said, and went back to her dough. She heard him pour himself a cup of coffee and settle into the chair at the kitchen table, the same chair he'd sat in the night he'd come to talk to her about Carter's shoulder and the receipts and the arrangement between them. He sat there while she worked and didn't speak, and she let the quiet sit between them without filling it, because she had learned somewhere along the way that quiet was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was the most comfortable thing two people could share. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, cold and pale and enormous. The way Wyoming skies always were, like they had opinions about things and weren't afraid to express them. Margaret worked the dough, and the kitchen was warm, and the coffee was on, and somewhere out on the range, the morning crew was beginning to stir. She had been at Whitaker Ranch for 3 weeks. The men no longer called her the little town bride. They hadn't found a new name for her yet. But Tommy Gillis, who was 17 years old and sent half his wages home to Nebraska, and had the appetite of a man twice his size, had started leaving a single wildflower on the kitchen windowsill every morning when he passed by on the way to the barn. Not always the same flower. Not always a particularly impressive flower. Sometimes it was just a dried piece of winter sage, which was technically speaking a weed. But it was there every morning, and she never said anything about it to him, and he never said anything about it to her, and she thought that was probably one of the better arrangements she'd managed since arriving in Wyoming territory. She cut the pie dough into rounds and started laying them in the pan. Caleb's coffee cup made a soft sound against the table. "Miss Ellis," he said. "Mr. Whitaker," she said back. "When you're ready to tell me what else needs fixing on this ranch," he said, "I'm ready to hear it." She kept working. Outside, the day was coming in through the kitchen window, gray and wide and cold and real. "I'll make a list," she said. The list she made for Caleb Whitaker was 3 pages long. She wrote it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning before anyone else was up, in her small and precise handwriting, and when she was done, she set it on the dining room table beside his coffee cup and went back to making breakfast. She heard him come in at 6. She heard the pause when he saw the pages. She heard the long silence that followed, the kind that meant he was reading. Actually reading, not just scanning. I didn't come into the kitchen right away. She worked through the biscuits, through the eggs, through the second pot of coffee, and the hands started filtering in. And still, he hadn't said anything. Carter took his coffee from the counter by the stove, without looking at her, which meant his shoulder was bad this morning. Tommy Gillis came through the back door and left something small and yellow on the kitchen windowsill, and was gone before she could have said a word, even if she'd planned to. Caleb walked in when the kitchen was half cleared from breakfast, when most of the men had taken their gear and headed out for the morning work. He carried the 3 pages in his hand. He sat down at the table. He set the list on the table between them and pressed his palm flat against it, the way a man does when he's trying to decide whether a thing is an accusation or a gift and hasn't landed on the answer yet. "The roof over the south bunkhouse," he said. "It's losing heat through the back corner," she said. "The men closest to it sleep cold. Roy Finch has been coughing for 2 weeks. I knew about the cough. I didn't know about the roof." "You knew about the cough," she repeated quietly, and let that sit. His jaw tightened. Not at her, she had learned to read the difference between a man tensing against an outside thing and a man tensing against himself. This was the second kind. "The supply order's going through Rollins," he said. "The merchant isn't the only problem," she said. "The ordering schedule itself is wrong. You're paying for 2 trips a month when one well-organized trip would cover everything and cost less. I can run that order from the kitchen inventory. I know what gets used and when." "You've been tracking the usage." "Since the 2nd week," she said. "It wasn't difficult. Nobody was doing it. He looked at her across the table with an expression that she was beginning to know well, that careful, complicated look that meant she'd said something he didn't have a prepared response for. "You could have brought this to me earlier," he said. "I wanted to be sure," she said. "I don't bring problems without evidence. And I don't bring evidence I haven't verified." "That's methodical." "That's how I was taught," she said. "If you're going to tell someone the floor is rotting under their feet, you'd better have stood on it yourself first." He picked up the list again and turned to the second page. She watched him work through it, the feed storage problems she'd identified from listening to Carter and Dale talk at the supper table for 3 weeks, the pattern in the cattle records that didn't match what she'd been hearing about the East pasture, the discrepancy in the hay supply that she'd cross-referenced against Eli's casual conversation, and 2 sets of invoices she'd found in the same kitchen drawer as the merchant receipts. He stopped at the bottom of the second page. His hand went still. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice had shifted. Not angry. Margaret had a finely calibrated sense for when a man was actually angry versus when a man sounded tight because something had hit close to a place he kept protected. This was the second thing. She looked at where his finger was resting on the page. "The cattle count discrepancy," she said. "In the East pasture." "Yes. Eli mentioned the numbers to Dale at supper 2 Thursdays ago," she said. "I was in the kitchen. The window was open." "Eli doesn't know about this problem." "No," she said. "He doesn't. He was talking about the number of cattle he'd counted that afternoon, and it didn't match what was on the invoice sheet pinned to the supply board, and he mentioned it because he thought he'd miscounted, and Dale said probably he had, because the numbers were always a little off out on the East pasture, and Eli accepted that and moved on." Caleb was very quiet. "But the invoice sheet shouldn't be off," she said. "Invoice sheets are supposed to be exact. That's the whole point of them." He set the list down. He didn't look at her for a moment. He looked at the middle distance at the wall behind her, with the focused non-focus of a man running calculations that she wasn't privy to, but could feel the weight of from across the table. "How long have you noticed things like this?" he asked. Not about the ranch, about her. It was a personal question wearing the clothes of a practical one, and she recognized it as such. "As long as I can remember," she said. "I notice things. I always have. Most people find it irritating eventually." "I don't," he said. She looked at him. He met her eyes for a moment, direct, unguarded, which was unusual enough that she registered it. "Good," she said. "I took the list with him when he left." He was gone for most of the morning, and she heard from Eli at midday that Caleb had ridden out to the East pasture with Carter and 2 of the senior hands, and that Carter had come back with the expression he wore when something had been confirmed that he'd suspected and hadn't had the information to prove. Margaret filed that away and went on making dinner. The East pasture problem turned out to be significant. She didn't learn the full shape of it at once. She wasn't supposed to know about it at all, technically, except that she was a woman who kept her ears open and her face neutral and let people forget she was in the room, which was a skill she had developed so long ago that she no longer consciously deployed it. It simply operated. She absorbed information the way the kitchen walls absorbed heat steadily, without announcement, and with the kind of thoroughness that takes time to fully appreciate. What she pieced together over the following days was this. Cattle had been going missing from the East pasture for approximately 3 months. Not in large numbers, not the kind of numbers that rang alarm bells immediately, but steadily, consistently, in a pattern that looked like natural attrition. If you weren't watching closely, and looked like something else entirely if you were. Caleb had known something was off. He hadn't been able to identify exactly what or where the break in the chain was. The invoice discrepancy she'd flagged gave him the thread he needed. She didn't ask him about it directly. It wasn't her business. In the strict sense, her business was the kitchen, the household, the management of the domestic operations of the ranch, and she was clear-eyed about the boundaries of that, even if those boundaries had already expanded considerably from what she'd expected when she arrived. She had found a problem that belonged to him, and she had given it to him, and what he did with it was his to decide. But she watched Carter come into breakfast 4 days later with a different kind of tension in his shoulders than the cold morning stiffness she'd learned to read, and she doubled the strength of his coffee without comment. And when Dale Finch came in behind him, and the two of them exchanged a look across the table that contained an entire conversation she wasn't part of, she noticed the particular angle of relief in it and thought they found something. She was right. She was usually right about things like that. What she didn't anticipate was Caleb appearing in the kitchen doorway that evening after supper when she was alone and saying without preamble, "I owe you something." She looked up from the bread she was working. "You don't. I tracked 3 months of cattle loss back to a hand I hired in August," he said. Jerome Pratt. He was skimming from the East pasture herd and selling to a broker 2 counties over who wasn't asking questions. The invoice discrepancy you found was his mistake. He altered the numbers going out, but forgot to adjust the incoming record. She looked at him steadily. "Where is he now?" "Carter escorted him off the property this morning. I've sent word to the territorial office." He paused. "The losses are recoverable. Most of it." "Good," she said. "Margaret," he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She was aware of that. She kept her face even. "I should have seen it myself," he said. "That's on me. But you found it because you were paying attention to my ranch in a way that nobody that I hadn't." He stopped, tried again. "I'm not good at this," he said, "at saying things." "You're doing fine," she said. "I'm trying to say thank you." "I know," she said. "You're welcome, Mr. Whitaker." "Caleb," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Caleb," she said. He nodded once and left, and she stood in the warm kitchen and let out a slow breath and went back to the bread, pressing her knuckles into the dough with slightly more force than strictly necessary, which was as close as she generally came to expressing the things she wasn't ready to put into words. The 4th week brought Nora Braddock. Nora Braddock was the wife of William Braddock, who owned the Braddock Trading Company in Rawlins and was, by any measure that mattered in Wyoming Territory, in 1878, a woman of social consequence. She arrived at Whitaker Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in a covered wagon with a driver, her youngest daughter sitting beside her, and an expression on her face that said she had come to evaluate something and had already mostly made up her mind about what she'd find. Margaret was in the kitchen when Eli came running to tell her there was company, and she wiped her hands on her apron and walked out to meet them, because there was nobody else to do it, and she was the woman of the house, and those were simply the facts of her situation, regardless of how strange they still felt from the inside. Nora Braddock looked at Margaret the way certain women of a particular social position look at other women, top to bottom, assessing, cataloging, making determinations that would be shared later at considerable length with considerable conviction. Margaret had encountered this category of look before. She met it with a neutral pleasantness that was entirely genuine and entirely impenetrable. "You must be Mrs. Whitaker," Nora said. The title landed with a slightly odd weight. Margaret was still adjusting to it herself. They had said the words in front of a judge in Rawlins, at the end of her first week, 10 minutes of legal formality in a clerk's office, and she had signed the papers, and it had been done, and she had been a wife in the eyes of Wyoming Territory ever since, without feeling particularly different about anything. "I am," Margaret said. "Please come in. I'll put coffee on." "How kind," Nora said, with the particular inflection of a woman who has not decided yet whether something is kind or merely adequate. The daughter, her name was Cecily. She was perhaps 19, and she had her mother's sharp eyes, without yet having her mother's certainty about what to do with them, followed them in with a slightly apologetic expression that Margaret found herself warming to. Nora sat in the front room and accepted coffee and made conversation that was really inspection wearing the clothes of conversation, asking about the household, about how Margaret found Wyoming, about how she was managing the domestic challenges of such a large operation. Margaret answered everything directly and without performance. She didn't try to impress Nora Braddock. She wasn't interested in being impressed by Nora Braddock. She was simply a woman sitting in a room being questioned by another woman, and she could be patient about that. "I understand you've made quite an impression on the ranch hands," Nora said with a particular brightness that held something underneath it. "I've heard things." "I hope they've been well," Margaret said pleasantly. "They've been surprising," Nora said. "For a woman with your," she paused delicately, "background." Cecily made a small sound and looked at the window. "My background," Margaret said. Well, you weren't exactly what anyone expected Caleb to choose, Nora said with the frank directness of a woman who considered social frankness a form of kindness. He's a wealthy man, an eligible man. People had expectations. They often do, Margaret said. You understand what I'm saying? Perfectly, Margaret said. You're saying that people believed a man with money should have married a woman with a more impressive pedigree, and that my arriving here with 2 suitcases and a plain dress was a disappointment to their expectations, which were never mine to manage. She smiled. Have some more coffee, Mrs. Braddock. Nora Braddock stared at her. Cecily made another small sound, and this one Margaret was fairly certain was suppressed laughter. Nora Braddock left 2 hours later, with less certainty than she'd arrived, with which Margaret considered a reasonable outcome. Cecily lingered an extra 10 minutes on the pretext of admiring the kitchen. The real pretext, Margaret thought, was that she wanted a moment without her mother in the room, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and said quietly, "She doesn't mean harm. She's just very sure she's right about most things." "Most people like that aren't unkind," Margaret said. "They're just not used to being surprised." Cecily looked at her with an expression that Margaret recognized the look of a young woman encountering someone she hadn't expected to find interesting. "How do you do that?" she asked. "Do what?" "Not care what she thinks. It doesn't make you angry." Margaret considered this honestly. "It used to," she said. "For a long time it did. Then I decided that the people who would make up their minds about me before knowing me weren't the people whose opinions I needed. And after that, it got considerably simpler." Cecily nodded slowly. Then, "Your kitchen smells extraordinary." "Come back on a Saturday," Margaret said. "I'm making apple pie." Cecily came back on Saturday. Caleb found out about Nora Braddock's visit from Carter, who had apparently heard a summary version of the front room conversation from Eli, who had been listening from the hallway, which was a fact Margaret would have found exasperating if she hadn't known from her first week that Eli Pruitt was constitutionally incapable of being in proximity to an interesting event without positioning himself to hear it. He found her in the kitchen on Saturday evening after the pie was made, and half of it had been distributed to the hands, and the remaining half was sitting on the counter cooling, and he stood in the doorway and said, "I heard you gave Nora Braddock coffee and a speech." "I gave her coffee," Margaret said. "The rest was just conversation." "She told William Braddock you were formidable," he said. "He told me this afternoon in town. He seemed pleased about it." "And you," she said, not looking up from the pot she was cleaning. "I think formidable is a fair assessment," he said. She set the pot down and looked at him. There was something different in his expression tonight, and tonight looser somehow than she was used to seeing him. Not relaxed exactly, because she wasn't sure. Caleb Whitaker knew how to be relaxed in the common sense of the word, but something adjacent to it. Something around the edges of his usual careful composure that suggested the careful part was for this moment slightly less load-bearing than normal. "She asked me if I was happy," Margaret said. He stilled. "Nora Braddock asked you that." "She did. I think it was her version of kindness. She's used to being the one who determines what things are supposed to look like, and I didn't look like what she expected, so she went looking for the explanation." "What did you tell her?" Margaret looked at him for a moment. The kitchen was warm, the pie was cooling, and outside the October dark was coming in fast and cold, the way it did in Wyoming, like it had somewhere to be. "I told her I was finding my footing," she said. It was honest. It was also not the whole truth, which was that she had been finding her footing every day since she arrived, and that some days it felt like the ground was becoming steadier beneath her, and some days it felt like the ground was entirely unfamiliar in ways she hadn't prepared for, and that the most unfamiliar thing of all was the man standing in the kitchen doorway looking at her with that look she didn't have a name for yet. "That's an honest answer," he said. "I try," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should have warned you about Nora. She means well." "I know she does," Margaret said. "I wasn't bothered." "No," he said slowly. "I don't suppose you were." He looked at the pie on the counter. "Is that apple?" she said. "There's a piece left. Sit down." He sat down without arguing, which she noted. A month ago he would have said he didn't need it. She cut the last piece and put it in front of him and poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across the table from him because she was tired from a long Saturday, and the kitchen was warm, and it seemed unnecessary to stand on ceremony about it. He ate the pie, and she drank her coffee, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind they'd been building slowly for weeks, the way people build things when they're not paying attention to the building, just doing it incrementally without making a point of it. "Tell me something," he said. She looked at him. "About yourself," he said. "Not the ranch, not the kitchen. Something about you." She considered this. It was unusual. He wasn't a man who asked personal questions, which she'd understood from the beginning as self-protection, as the behavior of a man who knew that questions invited reciprocal questions, and he wasn't ready to answer those. "I used to be afraid of horses," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "You grew up in Kansas." "Prairie, Kansas," she said. "Farm country. My father's farm had horses, but I fell off badly when I was 8, and I was afraid of them for 4 years after." "What changed it?" "A neighbor's daughter," she said. "She was 10, and she got back on every time she fell off, and I watched her one afternoon when she'd fallen off 3 times in a row, and she just kept getting back up, and I thought, if she can do it at 10, I have no excuse." She paused. "I got back on the next day. I was terrified. But you did it." "I did it," she said. He was watching her with that look again, the one she'd been cataloging without meaning to, adding to cross-referencing against other moments. "And were you still afraid?" he asked. "Every time," she said. "For about 6 months. And then one morning I wasn't, and I didn't even notice until that evening when I realized I'd spent the whole day not thinking about it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a story about horses," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He looked at his coffee cup. His thumb moved along the rim of it, a small, unconscious gesture she'd noticed before, the kind a person makes when they're sitting with something they're not ready to say. "When I was 12, he said, "my father lost half this ranch in a bad winter. We came through it, but I watched him. I watched what it did to him, to not know if he could hold it together. And I decided that I would never be in that position, that I would build something that couldn't be lost." She looked at him. "And I did," he said. "I built it. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that you can build something airtight and still be cold inside it." The kitchen was very quiet. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "The pie was good," she said. "Wasn't it?" Something crossed his face, something that started one way and became something else entirely, and landed as the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen on him in 5 weeks. "It was the best pie I've ever eaten," he said. "Good," she said. "Then tomorrow I'll teach you how to make the coffee properly, because you've been doing it wrong since before I arrived, and I've been too polite to say." He laughed. It was a short sound surprised out of him, genuinely unprepared, and she thought it was probably the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him yet, and she felt it land somewhere in the vicinity of her chest, and decided not to examine that too carefully. "I've been making my own coffee for 15 years, he said. "And it's been mediocre for 15 years, she said pleasantly. He laughed again, and this one was easier, and outside the Wyoming night pressed cold against the kitchen windows, and the stove burned steady and warm. And Margaret Ellis sat across from Caleb Whitaker in the kitchen she had rebuilt from nothing, and thought about getting back on the horse and did not permit herself to think about anything else. The 5th week brought the first real trouble. It arrived as trouble often did on the frontier in the form of a man. His name was Gerald Fitch, and he was a land agent out of Cheyenne, and he arrived on a Tuesday with papers in his saddlebag, and a smile that Margaret identified immediately, and with complete accuracy, as the smile of a man who had rehearsed it. She was in the kitchen when he arrived, but the front room of the main house was not far, and Gerald Fitch spoke with the carrying confidence of a man accustomed to making himself heard. So she heard most of what he said to Caleb without making any effort whatsoever to listen. Fitch represented a development company out of Cheyenne. He named it, but the name slid past Margaret too quickly for her to catch. He was interested, he said, in acquiring grazing rights to approximately a third of Whitaker's East Range. The compensation being offered was, he said, with the practiced inflation of a man who sets his own benchmark, generous. Caleb said nothing for long enough that Margaret stopped what she was doing and stood still. I'm not looking to sell grazing rights, Caleb said. Of course, Fitch said. This isn't about selling. This is a lease arrangement. Temporary. 3 years. The compensation is generous and the terms are straightforward. Leave the papers, Caleb said. I'll look them over. Margaret went back to her work. But she listened to the sound of Fitch's boots on the front porch, and the sound of his horse leaving, and then the sound of Caleb's silence, which was a different quality from the silence she'd learned over 5 weeks tighter, with something underneath it that she couldn't quite name. Carter came in for supper that evening with the same tight quality to him, which meant Caleb had talked to Carter, which meant Carter had concerns. She put an extra ladle of stew in Carter's bowl without a word. He looked at it. He looked at her. You heard, he said. Some of it, she said. You know the East Range. I know what you've told me about it, she said. I know it borders the creek. I know the cattle do well there. I know it's where you found the problem with Pratt. Carter's jaw worked. That third of the East Range is the best grazing ground on this property, he said. You lease it out, you lose 3 years of prime pasture. You lose cattle weight. You lose the breeding rotation. It's not generous compensation. I don't care what number he's putting on it. There's no number that makes that arrangement work in Whitaker's favor. Then it's not generous, she said. It's the appearance of generous. Carter looked at her. Yes, he said. That's exactly what it is. She brought Caleb his supper that evening herself. She usually had Eli carry the plates, but tonight she carried his herself and set it down and said without sitting, Carter told me about the East Range. He looked up. I know it's your decision, she said. But if you're going to look at those papers, I'd like to look at them with you. Not to tell you what to do, just because 4 eyes find more than 2. I was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his vest and put the folded papers on the table between them. Sit down, he said. She sat down. She picked up the papers. He watched her read. She was a methodical reader, and she did not rush. She went through the first page, and then the second, and she went back to the top of the first page and read 3 specific clauses again slowly. And when she set the papers down, she set them down carefully, the way you set something down when you want to be sure of yourself before you speak. This clause, she said, pointing. Subsection 4. He leaned in. A lease of grazing rights for 3 years is what it says at the top, she said. But subsection 4 says that any improvements made to the leased land during the lease period become the property of the leaseholder at termination, unless otherwise negotiated in writing 30 days prior to end of term. He read it again. His expression didn't change, but the quality of his stillness shifted. If they graze cattle on your East Range for 3 years, she said, they can put up fences, dig wells, grade roads, build any structure they classify as an improvement. And at the end of 3 years, unless you file specific paperwork exactly 30 days before termination, all of it stays with them. He was very still. And if they've made improvements, she said, there will be a legal argument for continued access. Not in the lease, not stated anywhere, but it will be there. It's a land grab, he said. His voice was flat and quiet. A slow one, she said, with a friendly face on it. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her and his hands at his sides, and she waited because she had learned when to wait. I almost signed it, he said. This afternoon, before he left. He had a pen ready. I know, she said quietly. I would have lost 1/3 of my East Range. Not for 3 years, she said. Possibly permanently. He turned around and looked at her. The lamp on the table lit one side of his face and left the other in shadow, and he looked tired suddenly. Not the tired of a long day's work, but the tired of a man who has just understood how close he came to something. Why didn't he think I'd read it carefully? Caleb said. Because most people don't, Margaret said. Most people see the number at the top and the word generous, and they stop reading. She looked at him steadily. You almost did. You're not pulling punches tonight, he said. Would you prefer I did? No, he said, and the word came out with a conviction that said he meant it completely. He came back to the table and sat down and looked at the papers with an expression that was more focused now, less shaken. The expression of a man who has stepped back from an edge and is now building a wall there instead. I want a lawyer, he said. A territorial lawyer, not Fitch's people. I want someone to look at this and tell me what it says in language I can use in court if I need to. That's wise, she said. I want you there, he said. When I talk to the lawyer, I want you there. She looked at him. All right, she said. You'd have caught this if I'd signed it, he said. You'd have found it. Maybe, she said. But you didn't sign it. You trusted your instincts. My instincts told me to sign it, he said. The quarterly numbers are tight and the compensation looked right, and I was tired, and I almost said yes to a man because his smile was easy and his papers looked official. He looked at her directly. You said 4 eyes find more than 2. They do, she said. Then from now on, he said, anything with a legal clause comes through this table. She nodded. Outside the wind was picking up. She could hear it finding the corners of the house the way Wyoming wind always did, probing for weaknesses. The lamp flame wavered and steadied. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. Eat your supper, she said. It's going cold. He picked up his fork. She gathered the papers and straightened them and set them on the side of the table, and the wind pushed against the house, and the lamp held steady, and the supper was still warm enough, and Margaret Ellis sat across from the man she had married, and thought that finding your footing was less about the ground becoming familiar and more about learning to stand differently on it. She refilled his coffee without being asked. He didn't comment on whether it was made correctly. She decided quietly that that was probably enough for tonight. The lawyer's name was Thomas Hale, and he practiced out of a modest office on the second floor of a building in Rawlins that smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and old paper. He was a quiet man in his late 50s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned long ago that the law rewarded patience over urgency. And he read Gerald Fitch's lease agreement with the careful attention of a man who had seen this kind of document before and knew exactly where to look for the teeth in it. He found 4 additional problems beyond what Margaret had identified. She sat beside Caleb across the desk from Hale and listened without speaking, while Hale walked through each clause, his finger moving slowly down the page, his voice even and precise. She had brought her own notes, the ones she'd written after Caleb had gone to bed that night, after she'd sat alone at the kitchen table and read the papers 3 more times, pulling out every phrase that had the quality of language designed to sound straightforward, while meaning something else entirely. Hale glanced at her notes when she set them beside the document, and then glanced at her with a look that had nothing of condescension in it, and quite a lot of professional assessment. You read law, he said. I read carefully, she said. He nodded once and went back to the document. When he was done, he set it on the desk and folded his hands over it and said, Mr. Whitaker, this agreement signed as written would have given Consolidated Territorial Holdings Company the legal architecture to claim permanent easement rights over approximately a third of your East Range within 4 years, possibly less, depending on how aggressively they chose to exercise the improvements clause. Caleb leaned forward. Consolidated Territorial Holdings. That's the parent company behind Fitch's operation, Hale said. They've been working this territory for about 18 months. I've seen 2 versions of this document before. One rancher signed. He's currently in a legal dispute that will likely cost him more to resolve than the lease compensation was worth. The room was very quiet. Who else? Caleb said. I'm not at liberty to say, Hale said. But I will tell you that you are not the first man in Converse County that Fitch has approached, and the pattern is consistent enough that I've already written a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne outlining my concerns. He paused. That letter went out 3 weeks ago. I haven't heard back. What does that mean? Margaret asked. Hale looked at her. It means either the office is slow, which is possible, or someone in that office has a reason to be slow, which is also possible. He said it without drama, the way a man states a fact he finds unpleasant, but not surprising. I'd recommend you do nothing with Fitch for now. Don't respond. Don't decline formally. Just let it sit. And in the meantime, let me make some inquiries. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then, what are you looking for? Proof of a pattern, Hale said. Individual incidents are civil disputes. A documented pattern of fraudulent lease agreements targeting territorial ranchers is something the Federal Land Office in Washington takes a different view of. He looked at Caleb steadily. If I find what I think I'll find, Mr. Whitaker, this won't end in a courtroom in Rawlins. It'll end in Washington. The ride back to the ranch was mostly silent, which suited Margaret. She was thinking, turning the shape of what Hale had said over in her mind, the way she turned a problem in a recipe, looking at it from different angles, testing where the weak points were, where the assumptions were, what could be done with what they had. Caleb broke the silence about halfway home. "You knew it was bigger than Fitch," he said. "I suspected," she said. The subsection 4 language was too clean, too practiced. A local operator making up a lease agreement doesn't write it that way. That language was written by someone who'd used it before. He was quiet again. Then, "How did you learn to read things like that?" She thought about Clara Bowen, the boarding house in Wichita. The contracts Clara had made her read every time a new supply agreement came through the door, sitting at the kitchen table at the end of a 14-hour day, reading paragraphs aloud, while Clara corrected her interpretation with the patience of a woman who considered ignorance more dangerous than hard work. "Someone taught me a long time ago that the most dangerous sentences are the ones that sound simple," she said. "Because simple language is easy to agree to and hard to argue against later." He nodded slowly. "I want to help Hale," he said. "If there are other ranchers who've been approached, if there are signed agreements out there." "Talk to your neighbors," she said. "Not in town, at their properties. Quietly, one at a time. Ask them if Fitch has come to call." He looked at her sideways. "That's exactly what I was going to say." "I know," she said. "I'm saying it first so you know I agree with it." I made that sound again. The short, surprised one, and she looked straight ahead at the road and kept her expression neutral, though it cost her something. November arrived with its teeth showing. The temperature had been dropping since the third week of October, but November in Wyoming was a different animal entirely. Not the cold of autumn, which had a kind of honesty to it, but the cold of a landscape that had decided it was done being hospitable and wanted everyone to know. The hands came in from the morning rounds with ice on their coat collars. The water in the troughs was freezing by mid-morning. The cattle were restless way cattle get when the pressure changes in the air and something is building on the horizon that isn't here yet but is coming. Margaret had been watching the sky for 2 weeks. She knew weather the way she knew kitchens, not from formal knowledge, but from years of paying attention to the things that happened before things happened. The particular way the clouds had been stacking to the northwest for the past 10 days. The smell in the air which was not quite right for ordinary cold. The behavior of the horses in the paddock, which Carter mentioned twice at breakfast without drawing any conclusion from it, just noting it the way men who work with animals note things that don't fit the usual pattern. She started preparing on a Monday. She didn't announce it. She didn't make a point of it. She simply began quietly, systematically, with the same thoroughness she'd brought to the pantry reorganization in her first week, working through every calculation she could make about what a ranch of 18 men would need if supply wagons couldn't get through for an extended period. She pulled the current inventory against her usage records and ran the numbers twice. She sent Eli to Rawlins on Tuesday with a list that was 3 times the size of the usual order and instructions not to substitute anything on it unless he came back and consulted her first. She spent Wednesday reorganizing the cold storage to maximize capacity and insulate what needed insulating. She identified which of the preserved goods would last longest, which needed to be used first, and what the rotation should look like over a 2-week period, if that's what it came to. She split extra firewood herself on Thursday morning, before the hands were up, until Dale Finch found her at it, and took the axe out of her hands, with an expression that mixed genuine concern with something that looked like being personally offended. "Ma'am," he said, "you cannot be doing this." "I'm doing it fine," she said. "You'll hurt yourself." "I've split wood before, Dale." "Not in a Wyoming November you haven't." He took the axe. "Tell me how much you need and I'll get it done." 3 times the current stack, she said without hesitation. "And I want it stored under the south overhang, not the east shed. The east shed roof is the one with the problem." He stared at her. 3 times. "At minimum," she said. "Tell Carter. Tell him I asked for it." Dale went. She watched him go and then turned back to the kitchen because there was still the question of the lamp oil and the candles and whether the medical supplies in the main house were adequate if someone took sick during a hard stretch when the doctor in Rollins couldn't be reached. She found Caleb in the hallway that afternoon, carrying 2 boxes of rifle ammunition toward the gun cabinet, and stopped. "You're preparing," he said. "Yes," she said. "For the storm. For whatever comes," she said. "A storm seems most likely." He looked at her for a moment. "Carter said the same thing this morning, about the northwest sky." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to watch it," Caleb said, "and to have the cattle moved to the southern pasture by end of week." "Good," she said. "The southern pasture has the windbreak along the ridge." "I know my land," he said, but not with an edge to it. Just a statement, the way he'd said things to her increasingly over the past weeks, direct without distance, sure without dismissal. "I know you do," she said. "I'm asking Eli to bring double the salt and double the baking powder from Rollins on Friday. If we lose road access for 2 weeks." "You think it'll be 2 weeks?" She looked at him steadily. "I think we should prepare as if it might be," she said, "and be grateful if it isn't." Howe was quiet for a moment, something moving through his expression that she'd learned to recognize as the particular discomfort of a man who is used to being the one who anticipates trouble and is having to adjust to the fact that someone else got there first. It wasn't wounded pride, she knew the difference between that and this. This was something closer to relief that had bumped up against habit and hadn't quite resolved itself yet. "Do whatever you need," he said. "I'll tell Carter you have full authority on the household preparations." "Thank you," she said. She turned to go. He said, "Margaret." She turned back. "You're not scared," he said. It wasn't quite a question. She considered that. "I'm not scared of storms," she said. "I'm scared of being unprepared for them. So I prepare. And then there's less room for scared." He looked at her for a long moment. "I wish I'd thought of it that way 15 years ago," he said quietly. And then he walked past her toward the gun cabinet, and she stood in the hallway for a moment before going back to the kitchen. The storm hit on a Sunday. It arrived the way the worst kind, do not gradually, not with the courtesy of incremental warning, but all at once overnight, so that the hands who'd gone to the bunkhouse under a cloudy but manageable sky woke at 3 in the morning to a world that had fundamentally changed its terms. The wind came first, loud enough to wake Margaret from a dead sleep, and she was up and in the kitchen with the stove going before she heard the first boots on the bunkhouse steps. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since midnight. She knew this because she'd put a thermometer on the back porch, one of the things she'd asked Eli to bring from Rollins, and she checked it when she stepped outside briefly to confirm what her bones were already telling her. The snow was horizontal. The visibility was close to nothing. She could hear the cattle from the southern pasture. Even from here, that low collective unease that large animals in bad weather make a sound that carried even through the wind. She went back inside and put 4 pots on the stove. Carter came in at 3:45. He was already fully dressed coat and all his face tight with the cold and with something else. The particular expression of a man assessing a bad situation and doing rapid arithmetic about what it means. "Roads'll be closed by morning," he said. "I know," she said. "Coffee's ready. Take it." "I need to get the men organized for—" "The men will come in for breakfast at 5:30, she said. "Hot food first. You'll get better work out of them with something warm in them. The cattle aren't going anywhere in the next 2 hours that they weren't going to go anyway." He looked at her. Then he took the coffee. "You prepared for this," he said. "Best I could," she said. He drank and said nothing for a moment. Then, "How long do you think—" "3 days at minimum," she said. "Possibly 5. Hale's letter to Cheyenne might be delayed." He looked up sharply. The connection she'd made storm isolation delayed communications. Fitch still out there with unsigned papers landed on his face with visible weight. "You think Fitch knows something about the timing? I think it's worth considering," she said carefully. "A man running a fraudulent operation doesn't leave things to chance if he can help it. A ranch that's isolated for 5 days is a ranch that's harder to reach for help and easier to pressure." Carter set his coffee cup down slowly. "If he comes to the property during the storm—" "He won't," she said. "Nobody's traveling in this. But when the roads open, she paused. When the roads open, we need to be ready to move faster than he does. Carter was quiet for a long moment. Does Caleb know you're thinking about this? Not yet, she said. He was up late last night checking the cattle reports. I didn't want to wake him for something I can't confirm. You need to tell him this morning. I intend to, she said. After breakfast, Carter picked up his coffee again and drank the rest of it standing, which was how he drank everything, as though sitting was a luxury he hadn't budgeted for. You know, he said, setting the cup down, when you got off that wagon in October, I thought. He stopped. I know what you thought, she said. I was wrong, he said simply, and without elaboration, because Carter was not a man who added decoration to necessary statements. You were working with what you had, she said. He grunted. It was she had learned his version of agreement. He put his hat on and went back out into the storm, and she turned back to her 4 pots and thought about Fitch and the Territorial Land Office and the letter Hale had sent 3 weeks ago that still hadn't been answered, and all the ways that silence from an official body can mean something more intentional than delay. She had the breakfast ready at 5:30 exactly. 18 men came through the kitchen that morning, every hand on the property, including 4 who normally ate early and were out before the others, and they filled the dining room with the particular noise of people who are wary and need to be steadied. And Margaret moved through the room herself, pouring coffee and setting plates and talking to each one briefly. Not about the storm, not about the difficulty of it, but about small things. Roy Finch's cough, which was better since she'd addressed the bunkhouse roof issue. Young Tommy's new boots, which she'd noticed him breaking in all week. Dale's opinion on whether the South Herd or the North Herd would do better in sustained cold, which she asked purely because Dale needed to feel his expertise was valued, and it cost her nothing to ask and gave him something to hold on to. She was managing the room the way she managed a kitchen, reading what each person needed and providing it without making a performance of the providing. And she was aware at some level underneath the work of it that she was doing something her mother had done in the worst years of the farm in Kansas, when the money was short and the weather was bad and the fear was real. She was making the room feel like it was going to be all right by acting as though she believed it, which was not the same as lying, because she did believe it mostly, while also knowing the next several days were going to be genuinely hard. Caleb came in last. He looked at the room, at the men eating at the coffee, going around at the plates coming out, and then he looked at her across the length of the dining room with an expression that she felt in her sternum before she'd fully processed it. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It wasn't the look of a man observing someone doing a job well. It was something more complicated and more personal than that, and she held it for exactly 1 second before she broke away and went back to the kitchen, because there was work to do, and she was not going to stand in the middle of a storm response having feelings about her husband's expression. She had him alone briefly after the room cleared, when the hands had taken their assignments and gone out in pairs, and the dining room was empty. She told him about Fitch, about the timing, about what she'd been thinking since 3 in the morning. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand as one of his better qualities, the ability to receive information fully before responding to it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then, "You think there's someone in the Territorial Land Office who's connected to Consolidated. I think Hale's letter went nowhere for a reason," she said. "And I think a company that's operating this kind of scheme in multiple counties has probably made sure the people who could slow them down aren't motivated to do so." "Corruption," he said flatly. "Influence," she said, which in practical terms is the same thing. His jaw worked. "Hale needs to know." "Hale already suspects it," she said. "He said it himself. Possibly someone in that office has a reason to be slow. He's been careful with that letter. I'd be surprised if he hasn't sent a second copy somewhere else." "Where?" "Federal," she said. "If the Territorial Office is compromised, the Federal Land Office in Washington is the next step. It's slower, but it's outside Consolidated's local reach." He looked at her steadily. "You've been working this through all morning. Since 3 o'clock, she said, while you were cooking breakfast for 18 men. People still need to eat during a crisis, she said. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, then looked up at her and said, "What do you need from me?" "When the roads open," she said. I need you to ride to Hale before Fitch can get to us. Not to respond to Fitch. Hale said, don't respond. But to tell Hale what I've told you about the timing, about the possibility of a compromised territorial office. He needs that information before he decides his next move. And in the meantime, she said, we keep the ranch running. We keep the men fed and warm and working. We don't let Consolidated see anything here except a fully functioning operation that has no vulnerabilities worth targeting. I was quiet for a long moment. The wind was audible through the walls, pressing and persistent, and the lamp on the table swayed slightly in the draft from the door. You know what you're doing, he said. It wasn't a question. I know how to manage a difficult situation with limited resources, she said. That's what I've always known how to do. That's not a small thing, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. The first day of the storm was managed. Hard, but managed. The men worked in shifts the cattle held in the southern pasture, as Caleb had ordered the firewood under the south overhang exactly where she'd had it stacked dry and accessible. Margaret cooked 3 full meals and kept hot coffee available continuously, and made sure anyone who came in from the cold had something warm to come back to, which was a form of logistics, as much as it was a form of care, and she had long stopped trying to separate those two things in her mind. The second day was harder. The temperature dropped further overnight. Roy Finch's cough came back worse than before, and she pulled him off the outdoor rotation and put him by the kitchen stove with broth and willow bark tea, and told Carter that Roy was done with outdoor work until the storm broke, which Carter accepted without argument, which told her his own concern for the man was higher than his professional instinct to keep all hands available. Tommy Gillis slipped on ice in the barn and came up limping badly from his left ankle. She examined it herself. Not broken, she was fairly sure, but badly turned, wrapped it tightly, elevated it for 2 hours over Tommy's protest that he was fine, and then let him work the interior feed rotation, which kept him useful, without requiring him to be on that ankle in the cold. Dale's older brother, a man named Frank, who worked the northern fence line and had the unfortunate habit of working past the point of good sense because he considered stopping an admission of weakness, came in on the second afternoon with the early signs of cold exposure that she'd been watching for the particular pale quality around his mouth. The imprecision in his movements, the way he kept insisting he was fine with the emphasis of a man who has confused pride with information. She sat him down in the kitchen by the stove and wouldn't let him up for an hour and a half. He argued with her for the first 20 minutes. She didn't argue back. She simply stayed in the room and kept the stove hot and kept putting warm things in front of him. And eventually, the room worked on him the way warm rooms work on cold people, and he stopped arguing and just sat there, and after a while he said quietly, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker." "Frank," she said. "Ma'am." "Next time," she said equally quietly, "tell Carter when you're struggling. That's not weakness. That's how we keep people." He looked at the floor. "Yes, ma'am." "All right," she said. "Eat the stew." On the evening of the second day, she found Caleb in the hallway outside the room where Roy was resting, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders that something had happened. "What is it?" she said. He turned. "3 of the Decker cattle showed up on our south fence line an hour ago," he said. "Decker's operation is northeast of us cattle. Don't drift that direction unless something pushed them." She looked at him. "The storm pushed them." "Cattle don't drift 4 miles in a storm," he said. "Not on their own." He paused. "I think Decker's fence went down. If his cattle are moving, his men are probably dealing with a serious situation." "Can you reach them?" "Not in this," he said. "Not safely. Tomorrow morning, if it eases at all." "Go tomorrow morning," she said immediately. "Take Dale and whoever Carter says is best equipped. I'll have food ready for you to take. If Decker's men are in trouble, they may need it." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she still hadn't found a name for, and she thought with the careful, precise part of her mind that was always running underneath everything else that she was going to have to name it eventually, because she couldn't keep cataloging it as simply his face doing something. "I'll be back by nightfall," he said. "I know," she said. "You'll be all right here." "Caleb," she said, "I'll have supper ready at 6. The second twist came the following morning before Caleb left for the Decker property. It came in the form of Eli, who appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5 o'clock, with an expression that Margaret read immediately as something has happened, and I don't know how bad it is. There's a man, Eli said, at the south gate. She set down the pan she was holding. In this weather? Yes, ma'am. He came on foot. He's half frozen. Carter's got him in the tack room. What's his name? Eli hesitated. He says his name is Pratt, he said. Jerome Pratt. The kitchen went very quiet. Jerome Pratt was the hand Caleb had dismissed in October. The hand who had been skimming cattle from the east pasture and selling them to a broker 2 counties over. The hand who Carter had escorted off the property and who Caleb had reported to the territorial office. Margaret said, "Get Caleb." Eli ran. She walked to the tack room herself because she wanted to see Pratt before Caleb got there, because she wanted to assess the situation before it was assessed collectively, and because the instinct that had served her entire life was telling her at a high, clear frequency that this man had not walked through a Wyoming blizzard on foot to cause trouble. Howe was sitting on a hay bale in the corner of the tack room, wrapped in the blanket Carter had thrown over him, and he was shaking with cold, but his eyes were steady, which was its own kind of information. He was younger than she'd imagined, mid-20s, lean, with the look of a man who had recently been through something that had reorganized his priorities. He looked up when she came in. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Pratt," she said. "Why are you here?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his coat. Carter stepped forward, but Margaret raised one hand slightly, and Carter held and pulled out a folded envelope. He held it toward her. "I came because of what's in there," he said. "I came because I did a wrong thing working for those men, and I'd like to do one right thing before it goes any further." He paused. "It's got names in it. The broker I was selling to, he's not independent. He works for Consolidated Territorial Holdings. And the Territorial Land Office agent who was supposed to investigate the complaint Whitaker filed about me in October." He stopped. "That agent is on Consolidated's payroll, has been for 2 years. Margaret took the envelope. She held it and looked at him and said, "You walked through a blizzard to bring this." "Roads were closed," he said. "I'd been trying to get here for 3 days. I heard about the lease Fitch was trying to run on Whitaker. I heard Whitaker had a lawyer involved. I figured if there was a lawyer, there was a chance this could go somewhere real. And if it was going to go somewhere real, that," he nodded at the envelope, "is what they'd need." She looked at the envelope in her hands. Behind her, she heard Caleb's footstep in the doorway. She turned and held the envelope out to him. "Don't respond to Fitch," she said. "We need to go to Hale today, storm or no storm." Caleb took the envelope and looked at it, and then looked at Pratt, and the room held 3 people and a complicated history and the sound of the blizzard outside, pushing hard against every wall. "Why?" Caleb said. Not to Margaret, to Pratt. Pratt looked at the floor. "Because I was greedy, and I was stupid, and I worked for men who were worse than me," he said. "And because the man they're trying to take this ranch from didn't deserve it. Neither did the others." He looked up. "There are 4 ranchers in this territory who signed that lease. 4. And 2 of them don't know yet what they signed." Caleb was very still. "I can give you their names too," Pratt said. "If it helps." Margaret turned to Carter. "Get him something to eat," she said. "Hot. And let him warm up properly." Carter, who had every reason in the world to object to extending hospitality to the man who had stolen from this ranch for 3 months, said, "Yes, ma'am," and meant it. She walked past Caleb into the hallway, and he followed her, and when they were clear of the tack room, he said very quietly, "This changes things." "It changes everything," she said. "We can't get to Hale today. Not safely. Not in this. Tomorrow morning," she said, "the moment it eases, we go together." He looked at her. "Together," he said. "I found the subsection 4, she said. "I want to be there when Hale decides what to do with Jerome Pratt's envelope." He was quiet for a moment. The storm pressed against the house, loud and indifferent, the way forces larger than any one person are always indifferent to the lives they roll through. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Together." "Good," she said. "Now go get breakfast. You've got a long day." She turned back toward the kitchen, and behind her, she heard him say, not loudly, not with any particular ceremony, "Margaret." She turned. "Thank you," he said. It was the second time he'd said it. It landed differently than the first time. She thought it would probably keep landing differently each time, and that this was something she was going to have to decide what to do with, and that she was not ready to decide yet. "Get breakfast," she said. He almost smiled. She went back to the kitchen, and the storm held for one more day, and she kept everyone warm and fed, and as close to steady as 18 people in a hard situation could be kept, and she did not permit herself to think about anything except what needed to be done next, which was the only philosophy she'd ever had, and which had never failed her yet, even when almost everything else did. The storm broke on Wednesday morning. Not gently. Wyoming storms didn't do anything gently, but with the abrupt, almost indifferent quality of a force that had finished what it came to do and was moving on without ceremony. The wind dropped sometime before 4 in the morning, and when Margaret stepped outside at 5 to check the thermometer, the air was still and bitter cold, and the sky overhead was the particular hard, deep blue that follows a serious storm, the kind of blue that looks like the sky is apologizing. She was back inside and had the stove going before anyone else was up. Caleb appeared at 5:30, fully dressed, moving with the decisive energy of a man who had been lying awake planning and was ready to stop planning and start acting. He came through the kitchen, checked the temperature she'd written on the notepad she kept by the back door, looked at her. "Road's passable," he said. "Eli's checking now," she said. "Sit down and eat something first." "I don't need. You're riding to Rawlins and back in this cold with that envelope in your coat," she said. "You need breakfast. Sit down." He sat down. She put eggs and biscuits in front of him and poured his coffee properly, the way she'd shown him, which he'd adopted without ever explicitly acknowledging, and she sat across from him with her own cup and said, "Pratt." He looked at her over his coffee. "He needs to come with you," she said. "To Hale's office. His testimony isn't useful as a piece of paper. It's useful with him attached to it." "He stole from me for 3 months," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "He also walked through a blizzard to give you the evidence to bring down the operation that hired him to do it." She paused. "Hale is going to ask whether Pratt will testify. You need to have that conversation with him before you get to Rawlins." Caleb ate without speaking for a moment. She could see him working through it, the legitimate grievance of a man whose property had been stolen from him, sitting across the table from the practical necessity of a situation that required him to use his thief as a witness. She didn't push. She'd said what needed to be said, and she let him get there at his own pace. "You want me to bring him," he said. "I want Consolidated Territorial Holdings brought up in front of a federal land office inquiry," she said. "And Pratt is the clearest path to that. What I want isn't the point." He looked at her steadily. "It's the point to me," he said. She held that for a moment. It was a simple sentence. He said it simply, but it landed with a weight she hadn't prepared for, and she covered it by picking up her coffee cup. "Then yes," she said. "Bring him." Caleb nodded once. "I'll talk to him after breakfast." Eli came back in at 6 with the report that the main road to Rawlins was passable if you had a good horse and knew where the drifts were, which Eli did, because Eli knew everything about the territory within 20 miles of Whitaker Ranch, and collected this information with the thoroughness of someone who understood instinctively that knowledge of the land was its own form of security. Caleb had Jerome Pratt in the front room by 6:15. Margaret stayed in this kitchen. She could hear the conversation, not the words, but the shape of it, the particular rhythm of two men working through something complicated, where the power differential was clear, but the need was mutual, and both parties knew it. It lasted about 12 minutes. When Caleb came back through the kitchen, he said, "He'll testify." "Good," she said. "He's scared," Caleb said. "Not of me, of Consolidated." "He should be," she said. "They'll know he came here. The moment this goes to Hale, they'll know." "Hale will know how to handle that," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "But Pratt needs to be somewhere safe between now and when it gets to a court or a federal inquiry. He can't go back to wherever he's been staying." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "He can stay here." She looked at him. "I know what I'm saying," he said. "He stole from me. And now he's the best chance I have to make sure nobody else in this territory loses their land to the same operation. I can be angry about the first thing and practical about the second." "Yes," she said quietly. "You can." He held her look for a moment, and in it was something that had been building for weeks, not said, not named, but present the way. Heat is present in a room even when the fire is low. Then he put on his coat and called for Carter, and 20 minutes later, he rode out toward Rollins with Jerome Pratt and Dale Finch, and Margaret stood on the porch in the bitter cold and watched until they were too small to see anymore. Carter appeared beside her. "He'll be back by dark," he said. "I know," she said. "You're not worried about him," Carter said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I'm always a little worried," she said. "I just don't let it be the loudest thing in the room." Carter made his grunt. She took it as the compliment she'd learned it to be and went back inside. The ranch ran differently in the aftermath of the storm. The particular heightened efficiency of people who had been through something hard together and come out the other side intact. Roy Finch was back on his feet, cough mostly resolved, and she noticed with quiet satisfaction that he moved differently now, with a careful attention to himself that he hadn't had before. Not fragility, but awareness. The difference between a man who has been unwell and ignored it, and a man who has been unwell and been looked after and now understands the difference. Tommy Gillis was back on full duty, ankle-wrapped, refusing to admit it. Still hurt, which she knew because of the particular angle at which he favored it, when he thought no one was watching. She put extra calcium-rich things in his meals for 2 weeks and said nothing about why. Frank Finch, Dale's older brother, had stopped arguing about taking breaks in the cold. He came in every 2 hours on the outdoor rotation, without being told, sat in the kitchen for exactly 15 minutes, drank whatever she put in front of him, and went back out. It had become his pattern, unceremonious and reliable, and she thought it was one of the better adjustments she'd witnessed at the ranch. A prideful man finding a way to be less prideful about his limits, without requiring any of them to pretend it hadn't been a choice he made. Cecily Braddock appeared that afternoon, which surprised Margaret considerably, because the road from Rollins was passable, but not easy, and Cecily had come on horseback alone, which suggested a level of determination that her composed manner in the front room 3 weeks ago hadn't entirely prepared her for. "My mother doesn't know I'm here," Cecily said by way of greeting when Margaret opened the front door. "Come in," Margaret said. "You'll want coffee." "Desperately," Cecily said with the candor of a woman who had spent 4 hours on a cold horse and was done performing composure. They sat in the kitchen, which was where Margaret had all her real conversations, and Cecily wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and said, "I heard about Fitch." Margaret looked at her. "From who?" "Father," Cecily said. "He had a conversation with Mr. Hale 2 days before the storm. Mr. Hale was being careful about what he said, but Father has known Hale for 15 years, and he said Hale was more troubled than he's seen him in a long time." She paused. "Father came to Consolidated's lease presentation in September. He thought it was legitimate. He almost said so publicly." She looked at Margaret steadily. "He would have given their operation credibility it didn't deserve. He wants to help fix that." "How?" Margaret said. "He's been gathering his own records," Cecily said. "Meeting notes from September, letters, the name of the banker who introduced Fitch to the county businessman." She set her coffee down and reached inside her coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "Father's not a man who moves fast. He considers things carefully, but when he decides to act, he acts completely." Margaret took the paper and opened it. It was a list of names, businessmen, territorial officials. One figure whose title she recognized as a deputy to the Territorial Land Commissioner, with dates and brief notes beside each one that indicated some form of contact with Consolidated's operation. She looked at Cecily. "Your father compiled this." "In 2 days," Cecily said. "He has a good memory and a large correspondence file." She met Margaret's eyes. "He also said to tell you, and I'm quoting him exactly, that he was wrong about Caleb Whitaker's choice of wife, and he would be grateful for the chance to say so in person when the time is right." Margaret looked at the list in her hands, and then at Cecily and said, "Tell your father the time will be right soon." Cecily left an hour later, and Margaret sat alone in the kitchen with 2 pieces of paper, Pratt's envelope, which Caleb had taken, but whose contents she had memorized, and Braddock's list, which she had not, and worked through the shape of what they had assembled. The picture was becoming clear. Consolidated Territorial Holdings was not a small operation running a local scheme. It was a coordinated effort across multiple counties, with influence bought at the territorial level, and possibly higher targeting ranchers who were land-rich but cash-variable, the kind of men who saw a lease payment as a solution to a short-term problem, without the legal knowledge to identify a long-term trap. The fraudulent lease agreements were the visible mechanism. The corrupted territorial official was the protection. Pratt's testimony and Braddock's list were the beginning of an architecture of evidence that could reach the federal level. She wrote out a clean summary. One page organized by category, with her source for each piece of information noted in the margin. She wrote it in the same small, precise hand she used for everything, and when she was done, she read it twice and made 2 corrections and set it on the table beside her coffee cup. She heard Caleb's horse in the yard at 5:30. He came in through the back door with cold on him, and something else, a particular quality of contained energy that she had learned meant something significant had happened. He took off his coat and his hat and looked at her across the kitchen, and she slid the summary page across the table toward him without speaking. He sat down and read it. His expression didn't change, but his hand tightened once on the edge of the paper. "Braddock," he said. "His daughter came this afternoon," she said. "He wants to be part of whatever Hale is building." "Hale has enough to write to Washington," Caleb said. "Tell me," she said. He looked up. Then he told her all of it. The meeting with Hale Pratt, sitting in Hale's office, still cold from the ride, and talking steadily without flinching. The moment Hale had opened the envelope and gone very still, the things Hale had said afterward, and the things he hadn't said, but that had been completely clear. The Territorial Land Office agent named Silas Webb, who had been on Consolidated's arrangement for 2 years. The broker 2 counties over, whose name appeared in both Pratt's testimony and Braddock's correspondence notes. The way Hale had looked at all of it, arranged on his desk, and said quietly, "This is Federal Mr. Whitaker. I'm going to write to Washington tonight." "He's writing tonight," she said. "He was already drafting when we left," Caleb said. She exhaled slowly. "The 4 ranchers who signed the lease. Hale knows their names," Caleb said. "Pratt gave them. Hale is going to approach them this week before Consolidated knows the evidence exists." He paused. "He'll advise them not to make any improvements to the leased land. That's the critical thing. Once the improvements clause is exercised, the legal argument for permanent easement becomes much harder to challenge. If Consolidated finds out Hale is moving, they'll move faster," Caleb said. "We know. Hale knows. He's being careful." He looked at her. "He said something about you." She waited. "He said he wished he could retain you," Caleb said, "as a legal reader. He said he'd paid clerks who weren't half as thorough." She was quiet for a moment. "He's being generous." "He meant it," Caleb said. "I saw his face when he said it." He was looking at her steadily now the way he'd been looking at her with increasing frequency over the past weeks. The look she still hadn't named, except that she was running out of patience with not naming it. "Margaret," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly, so I need you to give me a moment." She said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at her. "When I agreed to the marriage arrangement," he said, I was a man running a ranch that was successful by every external measure and hollow in every way that I'd stopped letting myself think about. I had built exactly what I decided to build at 12 years old watching my father struggle. I had built it so well that there was nothing left to build, and nobody I'd let close enough to matter if I lost it." He paused. "I thought that was strength. I thought that was how a man protected himself from what happened to my father. You don't need anything you can't replace. You don't let anything get that close." She kept very still. "And then you walked into my kitchen," he said, "and read the pantry in 20 minutes and started fixing things. I didn't even know were broken, and I thought that was what you were. Competent, useful. Someone I'd made a practical arrangement with." He stopped. "That's not what you are." "No," she agreed quietly. "You're the person I want to talk to about everything, he said. "The legal documents and the East pasture and Roy's cough and what it means that I almost signed Fitch's papers because I was tired and the numbers looked right. You're the person I want to tell when something goes wrong and the person I want to be there when something goes right. And I don't know how to say that without it sounding like I'm describing a useful arrangement, because you're not a useful arrangement. You're—" He stopped. She looked at him across the table. "Caleb," she said. "I'm trying," he said. "You're doing fine," she said. And then, because she had spent 5 weeks being careful and practical and measured, and because she was tired, and because the storm had broken, and the ranch was intact, and Jerome Pratt was asleep in the spare bunkhouse, and Thomas Hale was writing to Washington, she said, "I came here because I had no better option, and I was 27, and I was tired of managing other people's households and never having one of my own. That's the truth of it." He looked at her. "And I have been surprised," she said carefully, "by how much this has become mine. Not because of the kitchen or the ranch, because of you. Because you listen to me, and you don't require me to be smaller than I am. And you told me to tell you when I found things you'd missed, and you meant it. And those aren't small things." She paused. "They're the things I stopped believing I'd find." The kitchen was very quiet for a long moment. "I stopped believing too," he said. It was simple. It was completely true. She could hear it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was not something she had done before, and which she did now without planning it, which was its own kind of information. He turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the stove burned steadily, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Wyoming dark settled over the ranch, like something that had decided finally to be peaceful. The following 2 weeks moved fast. Hale's letter reached the federal land office in Washington inside of 10 days. The speed of the response. A telegram to Hale's office. Then a letter. Then the announcement that a federal land inspector would be dispatched to Wyoming Territory within the month suggested that the problem of consolidated territorial holdings was not unknown at the federal level, only unproven, and that Thomas Hale's carefully assembled package of evidence had provided exactly the proof that had been missing. Silas Webb, the Territorial Land Office agent on Consolidated's arrangement, quietly resigned his position 3 days after Hale's letter was acknowledged in Washington. Margaret heard about it from Cecily, who heard about it from her father, who heard about it from the Deputy Commissioner's office, and the resignation was handled as a personnel matter, which meant it was handled quietly, which meant Webb had made an arrangement of his own with the Territorial Office and was cooperating with the incoming federal inquiry rather than waiting to be compelled. Gerald Fitch left Rawlins on a Tuesday. He was seen at the stage stop by 2 separate witnesses, one of whom was a hand from the Decker spread, who told his foreman, who told Carter, who told Caleb at breakfast on Wednesday morning. Fitch had not said where he was going. He had not said when he'd return. The general impression left behind was that he did not intend to return, which Caleb told Hale when they met again that week, probably meant Consolidated was cutting the local operation loose and retreating to whatever level of the organization existed above Fitch's pay grade. "That's expected," Hale said. "They'll try to insulate the senior structure from what the local agents did. That's exactly why we needed Pratt's testimony. It goes above Fitch." The broker Pratt sold to was reporting directly to a company director in Cheyenne, and we have that in writing. "So it reaches them," Caleb said. "It reaches them," Hale said. The 4 ranchers who had signed the lease agreements were contacted within a week of the storm breaking. 2 of them, a man named Art Corbett and a widow named Helen Marsh, who ran her late husband's operation with the help of her 2 adult sons, had already received notices from Consolidated about the improvements clause. Preliminary letters framed as courtesy updates, which Hale identified immediately as the first stage of the easement strategy. He moved quickly on both cases, filing for injunctive relief in the territorial court to halt any improvements pending the federal inquiry, and both injunctions were granted within 48 hours. Margaret heard Helen Marsh's name and asked Hale the next time she was in his office with Caleb whether she could write to her. Hale looked at her. "As a private citizen," he said, "you can write to whoever you'd like." She wrote to Helen Marsh that evening at the kitchen table after supper. She wrote in her small, precise hand, And she said nothing about law or legal strategy, because Hale had that covered, and she wasn't going to muddy his work with amateur commentary. She wrote instead about what it felt like to read a document carefully about why subsection 4 had caught her eye, about the particular way deceptive language is designed to look straightforward, because she thought a woman running a ranch operation in Wyoming territory probably had the same instincts she had, and might find it useful to know that those instincts were worth trusting. She wrote, "I know you didn't sign those papers because you were careless. You signed them because the situation you were in made the number at the top look like the answer to a real problem, and the people who wrote that document understood that and used it deliberately. That's not your mistake. That's theirs, and it's being corrected." She sealed it and gave it to Eli to take to Rollins. Helen Marsh wrote back within a week. The letter was 2 pages and entirely practical, and contained 3 questions about ranch management that had nothing to do with Consolidated. And Margaret answered all of them at length, and found herself looking forward to the reply, which arrived 10 days later, and was also 2 pages, and also entirely practical, and also she suspected the beginning of a correspondence that would outlast the legal situation that had started it. Caleb read Helen Marsh's first letter over Margaret's shoulder. She'd left it on the kitchen table and said, "You didn't tell her what to do." "It wasn't my place," she said. "You told her what you saw," he said. "That's different." "Yes," she said. He set the letter down and looked at her. They were standing in the kitchen, which was where they had most of their real conversations, and the afternoon light was coming through the window, and the kitchen smelled like the bread she had rising on the counter, and it was one of those moments that didn't announce itself as significant, but that she was already in real time storing as something she'd want to remember. "The federal inspector arrives in 3 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "Hale wants us both there when he comes," he said, "for the interview." "I know," she said. "He wrote to me separately." Caleb looked at her. Something that might have been amusement moved through his eyes. "He wrote to you separately." "He has questions about the subsection 4 language," she said. "He wants to know how quickly I identified it and what made me look at it specifically. He thinks the language may appear in other consolidated documents under a different numbering." "And you're going to tell him," Caleb said. "I'm going to tell him everything I can," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know what you're doing has value beyond this ranch." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I'm starting to." It was the most personal thing she'd said to him outside of the night. She'd put her hand over his, and she said it simply because it was true, and because she'd been raised by a woman who believed that truth delivered plainly was always more respectful than truth decorated past recognition. The hardest conversation came on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the storm broke, when Caleb knocked on the door of the small room that was still technically hers. The room she slept in, the room she'd been given on her first day, and stood in the doorway with an expression she recognized as the look of a man who has decided to say something that cannot be unsaid, and is past the point of choosing differently. "I need to tell you something about my first wife," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come and sit down." He sat. She sat across from him. The lamp was on the table between them, and outside the November dark had settled over the ranch, and it was quiet in the way it got after the supper hour. All the hands in the bunkhouse, the main house, to themselves. "Her name was Catherine," he said. "We married in 1869. She died in 1872. Fever." He said it flat, not because he didn't feel it. She'd come to know, but because flatness was how he moved through the things that had broken him, not avoiding them, just refusing to let the shape of the words do more damage than the fact itself. She was the kind of person who made a room better by being in it. Not loudly, just fundamentally. People were better around her. Margaret said nothing. After she died, he said, "I decided that I had been wrong to need someone that much, that it was a structural weakness in how I had built my life, that I had put something irreplaceable at the center of it, and when it was gone..." He stopped. "I spent 10 years building the version of this ranch and this life that couldn't be collapsed by a single loss. And I was successful. And I was..." He looked at her. "I think you know what I was." "Lonely," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you wrote to the placement agency," she said. I wrote to the agency because Carter told me the men needed better food, and I knew the real problem was bigger than that, and I was... He stopped again, and this stop was different. This one had something wry in it, something that was almost rueful, which was the most human expression she'd ever seen on him. I was lonely, he said, and I thought I could find an arrangement that solved the practical problem without reopening the structural one. And then I read your pantry in 20 minutes, she said. And then you read my pantry, he said, and found my receipts, and identified a cattle theft from eavesdropping at a supper table, and caught a fraudulent land scheme from a subclause, and fed 18 men through a 5-day blizzard. He looked at her directly. And put your hand over mine at the kitchen table. She held his look. Yes, she said. I'm not lonely, he said. I haven't been for some time now, since shortly after you arrived, if I'm being accurate, which I'm trying to be. He paused. But I wanted you to know about Catherine, not because it explains everything, but because you deserve to know why I was slow, why I made you navigate around a wall I'd built and didn't warn you about. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't mind the navigation, she said. I know you didn't, he said. That's part of what I'm saying. You adjusted for my damage without requiring me to declare it first, and I... He looked at his hands. I want to stop requiring that. I want to be worth less adjustment. She looked at him for a long moment. Caleb, she said. You are not a project. He looked up. I didn't come here to fix you, she said. I didn't adjust for your damage as a strategy. I adjusted because you were adjusting for mine at the same time, and we were both doing it, and it seemed to be working. She paused. We're practical people. We found a practical way through to something that isn't practical at all. He looked at her with that expression, the one that had been building since the first morning he'd sat at her kitchen table and watched her make biscuits, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the sitting there didn't already say, and she thought, I need to name this. I have been cataloging it for 2 months, and I know every variation of it by now, and I need to name it. It was the way a man looked at the person he was building his life around, not the life he'd already built, the one he was building now, the better one. I would like, he said carefully, for this arrangement to be something other than an arrangement. It already is, she said. Yes, he said. But I would like to say so. She looked at him across the lamp-lit table in the room she'd been given on her first day and said, Then say so. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way she'd taken his, and said, Margaret Ellis Whitaker, I would like to be your husband in every sense that matters, not just the legal one. I would like to be the person you tell things to and the person you let tell things to you. I would like to get it wrong sometimes and have you tell me plainly, and I would like to do the same for you. He paused. I would like to stop building walls and start building something worth being inside. The lamp burned between them. The ranch was quiet. Yes, she said. I would like that too. He didn't let go of her hand. She didn't move to take it back. They sat together in the room that was hers, that had always been hers, in the only sense that mattered, and outside the Wyoming night held steady and cold and honest, and inside the lamp burned warm, and it was, Margaret thought, almost exactly enough to count as the beginning of something. Almost. She thought the word with a small private precision. It was the beginning. There was more coming. She could feel it the way she felt weather in the air before it arrived. Not as fear, not as dread, but as the particular readiness of a person who has always known that the best things require you to be prepared for them. She was prepared. She had been, she thought, for quite some time. The federal land inspector's name was Augustus Crane, and he arrived in Rawlins on a Monday in December with 2 assistants, a leather satchel thick enough to suggest he'd been briefed extensively before leaving Washington, and the particular economy of movement that Margaret had learned to associate with men who had seen a great deal and had stopped being surprised by most of it. How was not what she expected. She had anticipated someone formal and distant, someone who would conduct the inquiry with the procedural coldness of a man executing a mandate from above rather than pursuing a truth he personally cared about. Instead, Crane shook her hand when Hale introduced them, looked at her directly and said, You identified the improvements clause. Yes, she said. How long did it take you? "The first read-through," she said. "Subsection 4. The language was too clean for a local document." He looked at her for a moment, with the assessing quality of a man updating a prior assumption. "Too clean," he repeated. "That's exactly the right way to describe it." He turned to Hale. "The same clause language appears in 14 agreements across 4 territories. We've been looking for the common source for 8 months." The room went quiet. 14 agreements. 4 territories. Margaret had understood from the beginning that Consolidated was not a small operation, but she had been working with the evidence in front of her 3 counties, 1 corrupted territorial agent, 4 signed leases in Wyoming. 14 agreements across 4 territories was a different scale entirely. It was not a scheme. It was a system. Crane opened his satchel and produced a document that he set on Hale's desk, and she recognized the subsection. 4 language immediately, the same clean practiced phrasing she'd read in Fitch's papers in November, but in a different lease agreement from a different territory, with different names and a different ranch. Word for word, identical. "They have a template," she said. "Yes," Crane said. "And finding the template is how we find the origin. Right now, we have the field agents Fitch and 3 others operating in different territories. What we don't yet have is the legal architect, the person who wrote this language, who structured the scheme from the top." He looked at Margaret. "The improvements clause is the most sophisticated element of the design. Whoever wrote it understood property law well enough to build a trap that looks on its face like standard lease boilerplate. I want to know what else you saw in that document that struck you," she told him. "All of it. The specific word choices, the placement of the clause relative to the compensation terms, so that the eye naturally moved from the number to the signature line without engaging the middle section. The way the termination notice requirement was phrased in passive voice to obscure which party bore the obligation." Crane listened without interrupting, and one of his assistants was writing everything down, and Hale sat at his desk with the expression of a man watching something he had hoped would happen but hadn't been certain of. When she finished, Crane said, "Mrs. Whitaker, would you be willing to provide a formal written statement for the federal record?" She looked at Caleb. He looked at her with that expression, steady certain, the expression of a man who had stopped having any ambivalence about who the person across from him was. "Yes," she said, "I'll provide whatever's useful." The inquiry took 3 days of formal meetings and generated a federal record that, Hale told them, with the contained satisfaction of a man who chose his words carefully, was the most thorough documentary evidence he had submitted to a federal body in 22 years of practice. Jerome Pratt's testimony, cross-referenced with Braddock's correspondence records, with the invoice discrepancies Margaret had identified in October, with the subsection 4 analysis she provided in writing, and with Crane's own investigative findings from 3 other territories, built an architecture of evidence that had no gaps large enough for Consolidated's lawyers to work through. Silas Webb, the territorial agent who had resigned quietly the month before, cooperated fully. He named the company director in Cheyenne, who had put him on the arrangement, a man named Harold Voss, who had been running Consolidated's Western territorial operations for 4 years, and who, Crane told them on the 3rd day, with the same economic precision he used for everything, was currently in federal custody in Cheyenne, pending a hearing before a territorial federal court. Fitch was found in Denver. He cooperated once he understood that Webb had already talked, and that Voss's operation was already dismantled. He named the lawyer in St. Louis, who had written the lease template the legal architect Crane had been looking for, and that name, when it went into the federal record, was the final piece that made the whole structure visible from the top down. It was over in the formal sense on the Wednesday of the 3rd week of December, when Crane shook Hale's hand, and then Caleb's hand, and then Margaret's hand, and said, "The 4 signed leases in Wyoming will be voided by federal court order within 30 days. The ranchers will receive written notification this week." He paused. "Mrs. Whitaker, your written statement is in the federal record. It will be cited in the court filing." She absorbed that quietly. Her name in a federal court filing. Her observation about a clause in a fraudulent document made in the kitchen of her husband's ranch on a November evening when she was too tired to pretend she hadn't noticed what she'd noticed, cited in a legal document that would protect 4 families and establish a precedent that would make Harold Voss's template impossible to use again in any territory where federal land law applied. "Thank you," she said, which was insufficient for what she meant, but Crane seemed to understand. Caleb didn't say anything until they were outside Hale's building in the cold December air, and then he said, "You know what you did." We did it," she said. "Margaret." Hale found the pattern. Pratt walked through a blizzard. Braddock spent 2 days pulling records. Carter trusted his instincts about the East pasture for months before I had the information to understand why. "You didn't sign Fitch's papers." She looked at him. "We did it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he took her hand in the middle of Rollins in the cold in front of anyone who happened to be passing on the street. And he didn't say anything else, and she thought that was probably the most eloquent thing he could have done. They were halfway home when she said, "Helen Marsh." He glanced at her. "I want to go and see her," Margaret said. "Not today, but soon. I want to meet her in person." "The widow running the operation northeast of here," he said. "She's been managing that ranch alone since her husband died, and she nearly lost it to a fraudulent lease she signed because she was trying to solve a genuine financial problem," Margaret said. "She writes good letters. She asks the right questions. I think she might need a friend more than she needs legal reassurance." He was quiet for a moment. "We'll go next week," he said, "before Christmas." She looked at him sideways. She said. "You don't think I should come?" "I think Helen Marsh will be more comfortable with just me the first time," she said. "You can come the second time." "There's going to be a second time," he said. "And a third," she said. "And probably a standing invitation to Sunday dinner within 6 months, because that's how these things go." He smiled, not the almost smile she'd been cataloging since October. Not the short, surprised sound that passed for laughter, but an actual full smile, the kind that changed his whole face, and she thought, there it is. There is the man underneath all that careful construction. He was worth waiting for. "All right," he said. "The first visit is yours. I'll come the second time." "Good," she said, and faced forward, and let the cold air move around them, and felt something she was not going to identify out loud, because she didn't need to, because naming things out loud had never been her particular method, but that she felt completely down to the marrow. The weeks between the inquiry and Christmas moved with the particular quality of time that follows a long period of sustained tension, not slow exactly, but aware of itself in a way that ordinary time isn't each day a little brighter at the edges than it would have been without the contrast of what came before. The 4 Wyoming ranchers, whose leases were voided by the federal court order, received their notifications the week before Christmas. Margaret knew the exact day they arrived because Hale sent a brief letter to Whitaker Ranch addressed to her specifically, with the notification dates listed and a single sentence at the bottom. "The work you did here mattered in ways that will continue to matter long after the files are closed." She read it twice and put it in the small box in her room where she kept the things she intended to keep. Art Corbett, one of the 4 ranchers, rode to Whitaker Ranch himself the day after Christmas to shake Caleb's hand, and was visibly surprised when Caleb said, "You should thank my wife. She found the clause that started all of it." Corbett turned to Margaret with the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental, and shook her hand with the same vigor Dale Finch had used in October when she'd released him from kitchen rotation, which she found she liked quite a lot. Helen Marsh was different. Margaret rode to the Marsh property on a Tuesday alone, as she'd told Caleb she would, and she sat in Helen Marsh's kitchen, which was smaller than hers, and had the particular organized precision of a woman who had been managing on her own, long enough to have systems for everything, and they talked for 3 hours. Not about the lease, not about Consolidated, not about the federal inquiry. They talked about running operations with limited resources, about the specific challenges of being taken seriously in a room full of men who had decided before you opened your mouth how much weight to give your words about the arithmetic of making a hard situation work through sheer methodical attention. Helen was 51 direct and had the driest humor Margaret had encountered since Clara Bowen in the Wichita boarding house, which she considered high praise. At the end of 3 hours, Helen poured 2 cups of coffee and said, "I want you to know that I read every letter you sent me 3 times." "I hoped they were useful," Margaret said. "The last one," Helen said. "The one about the subsection 4, where you said I know you didn't sign those papers because you were careless." She stopped. She looked at her coffee cup. "Nobody had said that to me. Not Hale, not the men from Consolidated, not my sons. They were all very kind about it in the way people are kind when they think you've made a mistake and don't want to say so directly. You didn't make a mistake, Margaret said. You were targeted by people who needed you to believe you had. I know that now, Helen said. But reading it in your letter from a woman who clearly understood the document. She stopped again. It mattered, she said. That's all. It mattered. Margaret looked at her across the small kitchen table. Come to Sunday dinner, she said. 2 weeks from now. Bring your sons. Helen looked at her. That's a long ride. I know, Margaret said. Come anyway. Helen came. She brought both sons, large, quiet men in their late 20s, who ate everything on their plates and looked slightly overwhelmed by the scale of the Whitaker Ranch dining room. And she and Margaret spent most of the afternoon in the kitchen while the men talked ranching in the front room. And by the time the Marsh party left at dusk, Carter had shaken both sons' hands and invited them back for the spring cattle rotation planning, which Margaret understood as the highest possible form of acceptance Carter was capable of extending. Caleb found her in the kitchen afterward cleaning up and said, Carter likes the Marsh boys. Carter recognizes competent workers, she said. He has good instincts about people. He didn't have good instincts about you, Caleb said. He had accurate instincts, she said. He was right that I was unknown and untested. He adjusted his assessment when the evidence warranted it. That's not a failure of instinct. That's exactly how good judgment is supposed to work. Caleb leaned in the doorway and looked at her with that expression. She had named it finally, 2 weeks ago, alone in the kitchen at 5 in the morning when she was making biscuits and not thinking about anything in particular, and it had simply arrived the name for it, clear and unambiguous, the way things become clear when you stop working at them. It was the expression of a man who had found the thing he had stopped believing he'd find, and who was not entirely sure yet what to do with the relief of it, but who was learning. You were right, he said, about Nora Braddock. She looked at him. I haven't said anything about Nora Braddock recently. You said people who make up their minds before knowing someone aren't the people whose opinions matter, he said. Nora came by the trading company last week. William told me. She asked him to pass along a message. What message? That she owes you an apology, he said, and that she'd like to deliver it in person if you're willing. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Tell her Sunday dinners happen every 2 weeks, she said. She and William are welcome. He looked at her. You're not going to make her work for it. She's already worked for it, Margaret said. It takes considerable effort for a woman like Nora Braddock to decide she was wrong and say so. I respect the effort. She picked up the next pan to wash. Besides, she brings good cake, Cecily told me. He laughed the full, easy laugh that she had been hearing more frequently, the one that meant he had stopped guarding against it, and she went on washing the pan and felt the warmth of the kitchen around her, and thought about how a life was built the way she thought about how a kitchen was built. Not all at once, not by grand gesture, but by the daily accumulation of small right decisions, each one a little steadier than the one before. The twist she hadn't anticipated came in January. It came as the important things often did, through Hale, who sent a letter in the second week of January that arrived on a Thursday morning, and that she read twice at the kitchen table before she understood what it was saying. Then she read it a third time to be certain. She was still sitting with it when Caleb came in for breakfast. He looked at her face and said, "What is it?" She set the letter on the table between them. He read it. He got to the relevant paragraph. She could tell the moment he reached it by the quality of his stillness, which was not the usual considering stillness, but something sharper, and read it again. The letter said that the Federal Land Inquiry into Consolidated Territorial Holdings had, in the course of its investigation, identified a broader pattern of fraudulent property instruments operating in 6 Western territories, and that the Federal Land Office in Washington was establishing a formal review process for contested property documents submitted from those territories, and that Augustus Crane had recommended by name Margaret Ellis Whitaker as a consulting reviewer for documents originating from Wyoming Territory, given her demonstrated ability to identify fraudulent legal language in property agreements, and that Hale was writing to determine whether she would be willing to be formally considered for the appointment. A formal federal consulting appointment. Her name submitted to Washington by Augustus Crane, who had spent 20 years in federal land law and had recognized in 45 minutes of conversation what she had been doing unsystematically and without formal credential since she was 14 years old in a boarding house kitchen in Wichita, reading carefully, finding the gaps between what language said and what it meant, and using that knowledge to protect people who didn't know they needed protecting. Caleb looked up from the letter. She looked back at him. "Well," she said, and her voice was steady, which cost her something, because underneath the steadiness was a feeling she didn't have adequate language for, something between astonishment and recognition. The feeling of a person who has been doing a thing their whole life in the margins and has just been told that the thing has a name and is needed. "You're going to say yes," he said. "I'm going to think about it," she said carefully. "Margaret," he said. "I'm going to think about it seriously," she said, "because a federal consulting appointment from a ranch kitchen in Wyoming territory is not a small thing, and I want to understand what it means before I respond." "It means," he said with the direct simplicity that was one of the things she valued most about him, "that you're being asked to do formally and officially what you've been doing since you got off that stage in October. It means that somebody with the authority to recognize what you are actually recognized it." She looked at the letter. "It would mean correspondence with the federal office," she said. "Potentially travel to review documents in person. Time away from the ranch." "The ranch will survive," he said. Carter would say, "Take it," Caleb said. "And if you don't believe me, go ask him right now." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I need you to know that I am genuinely, specifically proud of you, not because you're my wife, or because it reflects well on this ranch. Because you are extraordinary at something real, and it is being recognized, and that is what's supposed to happen." She pressed her lips together briefly. It was the closest she'd come to losing composure in front of him since November, and she thought that was probably fine. That composure was a tool, and not a personality, and she'd been confusing the two for long enough. "I'll write to Hale today," she said. "Say yes," he said. "I'll say I'm interested in the details," she said with the precision that was her native language. He almost smiled. "That means yes," he said. "It means I'm interested in the details," she said. "Now eat your breakfast." She wrote to Hale. The details were manageable. The appointment was structured as a part-time consulting role document review, conducted primarily by correspondence with occasional travel to Rawlins or Cheyenne for in-person consultations no more than 4 times annually. The compensation was modest, but real. The work was exactly what she'd been doing since October, formalized into a function that had a title and a place in the machinery of federal land law. She said yes on the last Friday of January. She told Caleb that evening. He put his coffee cup down and stood up and crossed the kitchen and took both her hands, which was not something he'd done before, and said, "I want to make a record of this moment." "What kind of record?" she said. "The kind where I tell you that the woman I married because I needed a competent household manager has become someone I could not have imagined and cannot imagine being without. And that I need you to know that those two things are connected and not contradictory, because it was the competence that let me see everything else." She looked at him for a moment. "That's the best thing you've ever said," she said. "I've been working on it," he said. "How long?" "Since November," he said. "Approximately." She laughed. Not the managed, contained sound she'd been producing for years in situations that called for warmth but required caution, an actual laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that surprised her by coming out. And he was smiling when it did, the full smile, the one that changed his face, and she thought, "This is it. This is the thing I didn't know I was looking for. Not rescue. Not belonging by permission. Not the tolerance of people who had decided she was acceptable after measuring her against their expectations. This. A man who had seen all of her, the competence and the precision and the stubbornness and the early mornings and the recipe books and the way she noticed everything and couldn't stop and didn't want to, and had said, "This is who I want," standing beside me. This is who I was building this for, even when I didn't know it yet. Spring came to Whitaker Ranch. The way it always came to Wyoming, late and abruptly, and with the aggressive cheerfulness of a season that knows it has kept people waiting too long and is trying to compensate. The pastures came back green. The cattle spread across the southern range with the contentment of animals that had survived something and knew it. Tommy Gillis's ankle was fully healed, and he had stopped favoring it 2 months ago, though Margaret still occasionally put extra calcium in his meals out of habit, and he still left something small on the kitchen windowsill every morning. Not always a wildflower this time of year, but sometimes a smooth piece of creek stone or a seed pod he'd found interesting, or once memorably, a small, perfectly round piece of wood that he'd carved into a rough approximation of a biscuit, which she found so charming that she put it on the kitchen shelf, and it was still there. Roy Finch's cough had been gone since December. Frank Finch took breaks in the cold without being asked. Dale had taken over the supply order logistics from Eli after Margaret trained him in the system she'd built, and the orders had come in, accurate and on budget for 4 consecutive months, which Caleb noted in the household accounts, with the satisfaction of a man who appreciates precision. Carter's shoulder was better in the spring warmth, which meant the careful cup of coffee on the counter by the stove shifted from necessity to habit, which Margaret thought was probably its better form anyway. Cecily Braddock came to Sunday dinner twice a month, with the regularity of someone who had decided she was part of something and was acting accordingly. She and Margaret had arrived by degrees at the kind of friendship that doesn't announce itself, but is simply there. One day when you look up, built out of kitchen conversations and honest disagreements, and the particular ease of 2 people who had both in different ways decided to stop performing and see what happened. Nora Braddock came once on a Sunday in March with William and Cecily. She sat in the front room with the same composed certainty she'd had in October, but something had shifted in the quality of it. It was less armor and more simply herself, which Margaret thought was a better way to wear certainty. When the afternoon was over and the Braddocks were leaving, Nora took Margaret's hand at the door and said, "I owe you an apology." "You don't," Margaret said. "I do," Nora said firmly. "I decided what you were before I knew you, and I was wrong, and I would like to say so plainly." "Then I accept it," Margaret said. "Plainly." Nora looked at her for a moment, and then made a sound that was very definitely a laugh, which was possibly the most surprising thing Margaret had seen since Jerome Pratt appeared at the south gate in a blizzard. "William said you'd do that," Nora said. "Then William has good judgment," Margaret said. "He always has," Nora said with the warmth of a woman who has been married to someone she genuinely likes for 25 years and doesn't feel the need to hide it. "Goodbye, Mrs. Whitaker." "Sunday dinners happen every 2 weeks, Margaret said. "You're welcome whenever." Nora came back. She kept coming back. She brought the cake that Cecily had promised was good, and it was very good. A honey cake with a particular spice combination that Margaret asked about, and Nora shared with the unguarded generosity of someone who had decided that the woman asking was worth sharing it with, which was Margaret thought the whole measure of Nora Braddock in one gesture. Helen Marsh came in April with news. She sat down at the kitchen table with the directness that Margaret had come to expect from her, and said, "I've been approached by 2 other ranchers in the eastern counties. Women. Both widowed, both running operations alone, both received correspondence from a company calling itself Western Land Associates." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "Different name from Consolidated," Helen said. "Different agents, but my oldest son looked at the letter they sent and found a clause in the 3rd page of the terms that reads." She produced a folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. Margaret unfolded it and read the 3rd page, and found the clause and read it twice. The language was not identical to subsection 4. It had been altered, different numbering, different placement, slightly different phrasing. But the mechanism was the same. The improvements clause was the same trap in a different coat. "Someone learned from Voss's operation," Margaret said. "Or someone from Voss's operation started a new one," Helen said. "Under a new name, with a new template modified enough to look different." Margaret looked at the paper in her hands. "Do the 2 women know each other?" "No," Helen said. "They both wrote to me independently through different people because my name had been mentioned in connection with the federal inquiry." "I need to write to Crane," Margaret said. "I thought you would," Helen said. "I brought the letters." Margaret wrote to Crane that afternoon. His response arrived within a week, faster than anything she'd received from a federal office before, which told her that the inquiry had not closed as neatly as it had appeared to close, that Crane had been watching for exactly this kind of development, and that her letter had confirmed something he had already suspected. He asked her to gather the correspondence and send it to Washington via Hale's office. He asked whether the two women would be willing to submit formal statements. He asked whether Margaret would be available for a telephone consultation. There was now a telegraph office in Rawlins that could facilitate a scheduled communication to discuss what she'd identified in the modified clause language. She was available. The telegraph consultation happened the following Thursday. Caleb sat across from her at the kitchen table while she worked through the clause analysis by written message with Crane's office in real time, passing notes back and forth through Hale's telegraph line. And when it was over and she set down her pen, he looked at the stack of notes between them and said, "That was extraordinary." "It was a clause analysis," she said. "Margaret," he said. "It was a thorough clause analysis," she said. He smiled and picked up the notes and stacked them neatly, which was what he did with documents that needed to be kept, and said, "Hale is going to want you to consider a formal partnership with his office." "He already mentioned it," she said. Caleb looked up. "When?" "Last Tuesday," she said. "In his letter. He was careful about it. He knows I'm consulting for the federal office, and he doesn't want to create a conflict. But he said, if the federal appointment ever becomes something I need, structural support for his office could provide it." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it," she said. He set the notes down and looked at her. "Is that the same as saying yes?" "It's closer to yes than I was 3 months ago," she said. I was quiet for a moment. She could see him deciding something. She had learned to read the specific texture of his silences well enough to know when one contained a decision in progress, and she waited. "I want to build you an office," he said. She looked at him. "In the main house," he said. "A proper room, with a desk and shelves for the document files and the correspondence and space to work without being in the kitchen." He paused. "The kitchen is yours, and I'm not moving you out of it. But you're doing federal consulting work at a kitchen table, and I want you to have a room that's equal to the work." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Clara Bowen's boarding house kitchen in Wichita, and the 14-hour days, and the contract language she'd read out loud at the table at the end of those days, while Clara corrected her interpretations. She thought about 2 suitcases and a plain brown dress and the stage stop in Rawlins in October. She thought about the pantry she'd organized in her first week, and the receipts she'd found in the kitchen drawer, and the subsection 4 clause on a November evening that had started something she hadn't known she was capable of starting. She thought about Caleb Whitaker standing on a porch on her first day, careful and guarded, and Caleb Whitaker sitting across a kitchen table in January, saying, "I need you to know that I am genuinely, specifically proud of you." "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." He built it in May. He built it himself with Dale's help and Carter's periodic supervision, which meant it was built properly and without shortcuts. And when it was done, it had a desk that was the right height for her, and shelves on 3 walls, and a window that let in the morning light, and a hook by the door for her coat that was exactly where she would have put it. She stood in it the first morning and looked at the document files she'd arranged on the shelves, the copies of Hale's federal submissions, her consultation notes, the correspondence with Helen Marsh and the 2 Eastern County ranchers, the analysis she'd written for Crane's office on the modified improvements clause, the ongoing files for what was now formally a second federal inquiry. And she felt with absolute clarity the thing she had not felt in the 27 years that preceded her arrival at Whitaker Ranch, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, with exactly the right person standing in the doorway watching her settle in. "Well," Caleb said. She turned around. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, and the expression she had named in October and refined every day since, the expression of a man who has built something he is glad to have built, and who finds to his continued mild surprise that it keeps being better than he expected. "It's perfect," she said. "Carter says the shelf on the left will need a brace in 6 months, he said. He says I didn't account for the weight of document files. Tell Carter I'll remind him in 5 months, she said. He smiled. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and it was, she thought, the most ordinary and extraordinary moment she could imagine. Two practical people in a doorway, in a house they had built together out of competence and honesty and the slow, deliberate work of letting each other in. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "When I stepped off of that stage in October," she said, "I was prepared to be useful. I was prepared to be competent and reliable, and to do the work that needed doing, and to make the best of an arrangement that was honest on both sides, even if it wasn't warm. That was what I was prepared for." She paused. "I was not prepared for you." He didn't say anything. "I was not prepared for a man who would sit at my kitchen table at 5 in the morning and let the silence be comfortable," she said. "Who would tell me to tell him when I found the things he'd missed and mean it? Who would take the hand of the woman who'd found his fraudulent lease clause in the middle of Rollins in front of anyone who happened to be passing?" She held his look steadily. "I was not prepared to find someone worth being unprepared for." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. A small, quiet gesture, the kind that doesn't announce itself and costs nothing and means everything, and said, "I was not prepared for you either." "I know," she said. "I'm glad," he said, "that I wrote to that agency." "I'm glad I answered," she said. He leaned down and kissed her, which he did now with the ease of a man who has stopped treating tenderness as a risk, and she let him, and the morning light came through the new window and fell across the document shelves. And outside the ranch was alive with the sounds of spring, the cattle in the pasture, the horses in the paddock. Dale shouting something at Roy across the yard. Carter's measured footsteps on the porch below. All of it. The sound of the place that was working, that was whole, that had been broken in ways nobody fully recognized until someone arrived and started quietly fixing things without waiting to be asked. Margaret Ellis Whitaker stood in the office. Her husband had built her in the ranch she had rebuilt from the inside out, in the life she had not imagined and could not now imagine living without, and understood with complete and simple certainty what she had known in pieces since October and could now say as a whole. She had not come to Wyoming territory to be rescued. She had not come to be managed or contained or made decorative or kept. She had come with 2 suitcases and a cast-iron skillet and 3 recipe books and every skill she had ever taught herself in every kitchen she had ever worked in, and she had put all of it to use, and it had been enough, more than enough, because enough implied a ceiling, and there was no ceiling here, no limit to what a person could build when they were in a place that wanted them to build. Caleb Whitaker had married a woman he thought he needed. He had found the woman he had actually been waiting for. And at Whitaker Ranch, from the bunkhouse to the federal document files to the kitchen windowsill, where Tommy Gillis left small offerings every morning without being asked, everyone understood one thing with absolute and unwavering certainty. The greatest thing Caleb Whitaker ever built was not the ranch. It was not the fortune. It was not the reputation that stretched across Converse County and beyond into the territories where Margaret's name now appeared in federal records, alongside the word justice. The greatest thing he ever built was the life he found the courage to stop building alone, and the woman who had walked into his kitchen with nothing but her own extraordinary self and made it finally a home.